Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I woke up to the sound of gravel shifting just outside my tent. At first I thought I'd dreamed it, the way loose stones grind when someone takes a slow step. But then it happened again. A short scrape, then silence. I lay still, listening, trying to figure out if it was a raccoon or just the ground settling. The night had been quiet before that. No wind, no insects. Just the usual distant trees creaking and the faint rush of a creek somewhere down the slope. I'd set up camp a few miles into a trail in the Ochoko National Forest. It was a solo trip, just me and my gear, trying to clear my head after a rough work week. My name's Elliot Ramirez, and I wasn't the type to spook easy, but something about that sound felt deliberate. Another scrape came, closer this time. I unzipped the tent a few inches and peeked out. A soft cone of white light hung over the center of my campsite. Not a flashlight beam, not a car headlight. It was suspended in the air maybe 10 feet above the ground, wide at the base, narrowing up into darkness I couldn't see. The light didn't cast sharp shadows, it just glowed gently, like it was made of fog and brightness mixed together. I stared at it, not breathing, waiting for it to move or flicker, but it stayed perfectly still. Then, after maybe 3 or 4 seconds, it faded. No snapping off, just dimmer and dimmer until it blended into the night. The trees closed back around the darkness like nothing had been there. I stepped out of the tent slowly, boots crunching over the same gravel that had made the noise. The air felt heavier than before, warmer too, even though the night had been cool when I'd gone to sleep. I looked around, scanning for someone with a flashlight, but the trail and clearing were empty. My headlamp beam felt weak compared to whatever that had been. I walked to where the light had been, crouched down and ran my hand over the ground. No marks, no footprints. The gravel looked undisturbed, except for the tracks I'd just made. Behind me, the tent fabric rustled slightly, even though there was still no breeze. I checked my phone. No service, which wasn't unusual out here. The time read 2:14 a.m. I frowned. I could have sworn it had been around 1:50 when I'd last checked before falling asleep, but maybe I was misremembering. Another faint sound came from the tree line to my right. Not an animal, more like someone shifting weight from one foot to the other. I turned the headlamp and called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded thin in the open air. No answer. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting for something else to happen. Instead, everything went still again. Too still, like the forest was holding its breath. I went back into the tent, zipped it halfway, and sat on my sleeping pad with my knees pulled up. My heart was still thudding, slow and heavy. I tried to tell myself it had been some weird natural thing, maybe reflected light from a distant road or drone, but it hadn't moved like any of that. Another scrape of gravel sounded, but closer to the tent now. I froze. The sound moved along the edge of the campsite, a slow, careful path, as if something was circling. I could hear it, but there was no shadow, no outline through the tent fabric. Then the scraping stopped altogether. A low hum filled the air for a second or two, so faint I almost thought it was my own ears ringing. It crept up and then disappeared. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand, making me flinch. No notification, just the vibration as if it had tried and failed to connect. I opened the tent again and stepped out, scanning harder this time. The forest was dark, but not pitch black. A thin veil of mist hung between the trunks, catching the beam of my headlamp in soft streaks. I walked toward the trees a few steps, feeling uneasy, but not wanting to just sit there doing nothing. That's when the light came back. Not above the campsite this time, but a little deeper between the trees. Another cone, smaller, angled slightly, pointing toward the ground as if marking a spot. It didn't pulse or flash. It just hovered, quietly, wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I took a few slow steps toward it, and it dimmed, like it was pulling away from me. I stopped. It settled again, steady. My breath fogged in front of my face. I raised my phone and tried to record. The screen showed only darkness, with a blurry white smear where the light should have been. After a second, the camera froze and kicked back to the home screen. I looked up, and the light had vanished again. This time, the air felt colder, and the silence felt heavier, pressing down on me. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of where it could have gone. There was no path it could have taken without me seeing it move. Behind me, the gravel shifted one more time, sharp, close. I spun around, heart in my throat, but nothing stood there. Just the open clearing and my small tent, faintly outlined. That was when my watch caught my eye. The digital display read 2:41 a.m. I stared at it, trying to piece together the timeline. I couldn't remember walking around for nearly half an hour. It felt like maybe 5 or 10 minutes since I first saw the light. I climbed back into the tent, zipped it fully, and lay down with my boots still on, staring at the ceiling. Every sound made me tense. Every slight touch of fabric felt too loud. I didn't sleep, not really. I just drifted in and out of shallow half-rest, waiting for something else to happen. It didn't. By the time the sky started to lighten to a dull gray blue, the forest noise slowly returned. Birds, distant wind, regular life. The air felt normal again. I crawled out and looked around in the pale early morning. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. No strange marks, no burned earth, nothing out of place, except my cooler. It sat a few feet closer to the fire ring than where I clearly remembered putting it the night before. I stood there a long time staring at it, then packed up without eating. My hands worked on autopilot, rolling up the tent, stuffing gear into my pack, checking the straps over and over. The hike back to the car felt twice as long. Every time the path curved or dipped behind trees, I expected to see that faint light again, hovering somewhere just out of reach. It never appeared. When I reached the trailhead, my car was just where I'd left it. No damage. No signs of anyone else having been there. The radio came on like normal. The engine started without hesitation. The drive home felt unreal, like everything was slightly off, but trying to pretend it wasn't. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun was already up. My neighbor's sprinklers ticked softly across the lawn. Everything looked ordinary again. Inside, I dropped my pack by the door and stood there in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the house settling. I glanced down at my boots. Tiny bits of pale gravel were wedged into the soles, a different kind than the trail usually had. Smooth, almost polished. I brushed them away and went to take a shower, but even with the hot water running over me, my mind kept replaying the quiet cone of white light hanging over that dark campsite, as if it had never meant for me to really see it at all. I noticed the pale sphere drifting above the tree line about 20 minutes into the drive. I'd taken the back road because the main highway had construction and I wasn't in a hurry anyway. It was late afternoon, that weird time where the sun dipped low but the air still felt warm. The sky was cloudy in patches with a heavy orange tint near the horizon. No wind, no traffic. Just me, my old sedan, and a long stretch of road cutting through farmland and woods outside a little place called Henson Creek. I'd been listening to a local talk station, half zoning out, when something caught my eye to the right. A soft glow hovering just above the treetops. Round, smooth, almost gentle looking. At first I figured it was the sun reflecting off a weather balloon or something like that, but it wasn't moving with the breeze. It wasn't tilted. It was just there, floating. I kept driving, figuring it would slide out of my field of view, but it didn't. It matched my speed almost perfectly, like we were moving together. Every time I glanced over, it was still in the same relative spot. That's when I started paying attention. I turned the radio down. The road noise felt louder suddenly. Gravel popping under my tires, the low hum of the engine. The sphere didn't change shape. It didn't pulse or flash. It just glowed a pale white, a little dull around the edges like it wasn't fully solid. I slowed down out of instinct, maybe to get a better look, maybe because some part of me didn't trust it. As my speed dropped, the light dimmed slightly. Not faded completely, just dipped, like someone turned down a dimmer switch. I watched it carefully, and when I slowed more, it dimmed further. I remember thinking, that's weird, like it was responding. I tapped the brakes again, and the glow almost disappeared, becoming just a faint outline. I could still make out its shape, but barely. Then I looked back to the road, and it was there. The same pale sphere, hovering about 10 feet ahead of my hood, dead center over the asphalt. No movement. No travel path between where it had been and where it now was. Just there, as if it had blinked into position. My stomach dropped so suddenly I felt lightheaded. I hit the brakes hard, tires squealing in protest, and the car came to a stop a few yards short of it. The sphere hung there, silent. Close enough now that I could tell it wasn't casting any real light on the road. The pavement under it didn't glow brighter. It just maintained its own soft brightness, self-contained. I stared at it, heart pounding, breathing shallow. The air inside the car felt stale. I rolled the window down slightly, but there was no sound from outside. No insects, no distant dogs. Even the leaves on the trees seemed still. I eased my foot off the brake, barely moving forward by inches, half expecting it to react. It stayed put. I tried turning my high beams on. The light from my headlights didn't reflect the way it should. It just sort of bled around it. The sphere flickered once, barely noticeable, like a blink. Then the radio crackled. Not static, just a short burst of sound, like a half second of a different channel before it dropped back into silence. I glanced down at the console. The display was still on, but the volume was 0, even though I hadn't touched it. I reached for my phone, gripping it tighter than I realized. The signal bars were gone. No service. I looked up again. The sphere had moved. Not gradually. It now hovered several yards behind my car, almost like it had stepped back the moment I wasn't watching. I twisted in my seat to see it through the rear window. Same pale glow. Same perfect rounded shape. I muttered something out loud without thinking. Not a full sentence. Just noise. My mouth felt dry. I edged the car forward again, slow enough to feel every vibration. The sphere didn't follow this time. It stayed behind, shrinking in the mirror, but still just as bright. With a shaky breath, I pressed the gas. The car rolled faster. The sphere grew smaller in the mirror. Then, just as suddenly as before, it appeared ahead of me again. Same distance, same spot on the road. I slammed the brakes, chest tight, fingers trembling on the steering wheel. It was like the road itself was being edited around me. No sound of movement, no visible transition, just reappearing. "I don't understand this," I remember saying, my voice barely above a whisper. The air felt warmer now, like someone had turned on a heater. I wiped my palms on my jeans and glanced around, trying to see if there were any houses, any sign of people. Just trees, fields, a broken fence on the left, nothing else. I tried reversing, slowly at first. The sphere stayed in front, keeping its distance. I reversed faster. It drifted back just enough to remain ahead of my headlights. My phone vibrated suddenly. I almost dropped it. No call. No text. Just a vibration, as if it had briefly tried to reconnect. And then the sphere disappeared. No fading. No lifting into the sky. It was there, and then it wasn't. The road looked normal. Empty. Dark edges, long shadows starting to form as the sun dipped lower. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, mind racing, unsure whether to move or stay completely still. The signal bars on my phone popped back in. Full service. I checked the time, 6:12 p.m. I could have sworn it had been closer to 6 when I first noticed the light. I looked at the car clock. It read 6:11. 1 minute difference, but I felt like much longer had passed. Eventually, I forced myself to drive forward. Slowly at first, then faster as the normal world seemed to settle back in place. No lights in the sky, no strange reflections, just the same empty back road. The rest of the drive felt longer than it should have. Every few seconds, I checked the mirrors, waiting for the pale glow to trail me again, but nothing followed. When I got home, the garage door opener didn't respond the first time I pressed it. On the second try, it worked normally. Inside the house, the microwave clock was flashing like it had briefly lost power, though nothing else suggested an outage. I stood in the kitchen for a while, trying to calm down, replaying the moment it had moved without moving. The logic of it felt wrong, like skipping frames of time. I didn't tell anyone that night. I didn't really know how to describe it without sounding like I'd imagined the whole thing. But a few days later, I drove that same road again during daylight, out of curiosity, out of some quiet need to check. Nothing was there. No pale glow, no distortion, just the same stretch of asphalt and the same trees lining the horizon. And the spot where it had hovered stayed unusually cold when I rolled the window down, like the air itself remembered something I couldn't explain. I noticed the shadow before I noticed anything else. It stretched across the dirt trail in front of me, thin and wrong, like it belonged to someone longer, someone with arms that bent at angles I didn't recognize. I slowed my steps without really thinking, eyes still on the ground. The shape shifted as I moved, but not in a way that matched what my body was doing. I lifted my arm halfway. The shadow didn't. I stopped completely and looked up, expecting to see someone standing just behind me, or maybe a low tree limb or a bird circling overhead. There was nothing. The sky above the trail was pale and washed out from the early sunrise, that soft, hazy orange you only got right before the day fully woke up. No clouds, no branches, no drone, nothing. When I looked back down, the shadow lingered for a second longer than it should have, then snapped back into something that looked almost normal. Almost. My name's Kieran Walsh, and this happened on a trail just outside Sedona, not far from the Bell Rock area. I'd driven out early for a solo hike before the heat kicked in. It was around 6:15 in the morning, cool enough to feel comfortable, but already hinting at the dry warmth that would hit later. I told myself it was just weird lighting. The sun felt low, pulling long shadows across the uneven path, and maybe I just spooked myself before my brain kicked fully online. I started walking again, glancing down every few steps, trying to convince myself everything lined up. For a few minutes, it did. But the longer I walked, the more I noticed small things that didn't sit right. The birds that had been chattering earlier went quiet. The distant sound of wind through the brush faded like someone slowly turned down the volume. Even my footsteps sounded softer, like the dirt underneath had somehow thickened. Then the shadow shifted again. This time it stretched wider than my body, like another set of shoulders had joined mine. A faint outline that didn't move when I moved just hovered against the trail as if waiting. My pulse picked up. I turned in a slow circle, scanning for anyone who might be messing with me. No hikers behind, no early morning runners, just winding red rock and sparse desert trees, the trail curving uphill ahead. "Hello?" I called out, feeling slightly ridiculous. No answer came back, not even an echo. As I faced forward again, the shadow shortened, returning to a more familiar shape, but I could still see a faint second outline beside it, like a photocopy that hadn't lined up properly. I forced myself to keep walking. Another 100 yards up the trail, I felt the air change. It grew heavy and still, like the moment before rain, even though the sky was clear and dry. My skin prickled, not cold exactly, just aware of something shifting. I noticed a low humming then, very faint. It wasn't loud enough to hear with my ears, so much as feel through my ribs, like something deep and steady vibrating far away. I slowed again. The shadow now moved ahead of me instead of beside me, stretching farther up the path than it should have. It curved slightly left, even when I walked straight. When I stepped to the right edge of the trail, it didn't follow immediately. I glanced behind my shoulder, half expecting to see, I didn't know what, just something. Still nothing. The hum deepened briefly, then softened, like it was adjusting to my movement. I found myself breathing more shallow, aware of every small sound around me. My boots scraped lightly against loose gravel. A single leaf rustled despite the lack of wind. I tried to rationalize it internally. Fatigue, lack of sleep, early light playing tricks, but my body didn't believe any of it. A sudden flicker passed over the ground like someone waving a hand in front of a light source. The shadow distorted into something uneven, then steadied again. I checked my phone out of habit. Full battery. Service bars normal. The time read 6:32 a.m. I lifted my head and focused forward, fixing my eyes on a bend where the trail narrowed between two rock outcrops. I told myself to just reach that spot and decide if I'd turn back after. Step by step, I moved forward. The humming picked up again, not louder, just more present. It felt like standing near a power line, that quiet tension in the air. The hairs on my arms lifted even though the temperature was rising. As I reached the bend, the shadow did something strange. It detached. Not fully, but it slid slightly away from my feet, separating just enough to look like it belonged to someone walking next to me. The shape flickered, blurred at the edges, then held still as if it had found its place. I froze. Slowly, carefully, I stepped forward 1 foot. The shadow didn't move. That was when I felt it. Not a touch, not pressure, but the sense of someone standing where no one should have been. I could almost picture a figure there without actually seeing anything. My mouth went dry. I turned my head inch by inch, heart hammering with a strange calm I couldn't explain. My eyes passed over empty air, sunlit stone, the narrow clearing. The space beside me was clean and still. The shadow twitched. The hum cut out abruptly. Silence dropped around me again, thinner this time, like the world was holding its breath. I felt suddenly exposed, aware of my own posture, my balance, the weight of my pack on my shoulders. Then, as if nothing had ever been wrong, the shadow snapped back under me, aligning perfectly with my stance. The air loosened. Sound returned in small pieces. A bird chirped somewhere nearby. The breeze stirred dry grass lightly. The trail looked normal again. I stood there for several seconds, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I told myself to turn around. Instead, I took another cautious step forward. Nothing unusual happened. No mismatch, no vibration, no displacement. I kept walking, though the unease clung to me like humidity. Every shadow I passed made me check the angle of the sun, the shape of my body, the direction of the light. A few minutes later, I reached a flat overlook point where the trail widened. From there, the desert stretched out in bands of orange and tan, the sun rising higher and painting everything gold. It should have been calming. I sat on a warm rock and tried to breathe normally. That's when I noticed another shadow stretching across the path several yards away. It wasn't connected to anything. It lay long and slim, like something had just stepped out of frame, but the trail ahead was empty. Still no one behind me. No hikers approaching from either side. I stared at it, heart beating slow and heavy. The shape rippled slightly, then elongated further like it was testing distance. The sunlight remained steady, no flicker. A soft vibration tingled through the soles of my boots again, just barely noticeable if I hadn't already been hyper-focused on every sensation. The hum returned in a whisper, lower than before. The shadow shrank suddenly and dissolved, blending into the natural shapes of the ground like it had never existed. I stayed seated for a good while after that, too unsettled to continue forward, too uncertain to run back. I waited for something else to happen, anything, but the trail stayed normal, quiet, and still. When I finally did stand and make my way back toward the parking area, nothing followed. No more mismatched shadows, no humming, no strange gaps in sound. But even as I left the trail and reached my car, I caught myself glancing down more than usual, checking the outline beneath my feet, half expecting it to drift just a little too far away again. I was taking out the trash when the porch railing started to tremble under my hand. It wasn't a heavy shake, just this low vibration rolling through the metal like something distant but strong was moving under the ground or the air. I paused with the bag halfway over the bin, listening. The night had been quiet and sticky, one of those late summer evenings where the air felt thick and warm even after dark. Cicadas buzzed in the trees behind the house, and the street was empty, except for the soft glow of porch lights and the occasional moth bumping into them. Then the humming came. It wasn't loud. It sounded more like pressure than noise, a steady tone that made the wooden boards under my bare feet feel faintly warm. The porch light flickered once, and I looked up automatically. A pinpoint of light shot across the sky. It moved fast, perfectly straight, like a spark dragged across black glass. No blinking, no tail, no sound. Just a sharp white point slicing from one side of the sky to the other, and then it vanished. The humming faded a second later, leaving the night feeling hollow. I stood there for a while longer than made sense, trash bag forgotten, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. Planes passed over this part of town sometimes, but they didn't move like that. Drones made noise. Satellites didn't look that bright, and sure as hell didn't make railings vibrate. I shook it off, dropped the bag into the bin, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. My name's Marisol Pena, and I lived in a quiet little development outside of Albuquerque. My boyfriend Theo wasn't home that night. He'd been working late at the auto shop, and the house felt extra empty without him moving around. I tried to go back to normal. I rinsed a cup in the sink, scrolled on my phone for a bit, and even turned on the TV for background noise. But every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the front window, half expecting the sky to do something else strange. Around an hour later, something made the dog start whining. Luna was usually calm, the kind of dog that barely barked unless the mail truck pulled up. Now she stood near the doorway, ears pinned back, staring at the ceiling as if she was tracking something moving above it. A faint buzzing filled the air again, softer this time, like it couldn't quite reach full volume. I called her name. She didn't move. The living room light dimmed enough for me to notice, then steadied again. I walked closer to her and followed her line of sight. Of course, there was nothing there. Just the same off-white ceiling we'd repainted last spring. But the buzzing stayed, thin and persistent, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it stopped. Luna relaxed slowly, but didn't lie back down. She just kept staring for another minute before finally lowering her head. I checked my phone without thinking. No notifications, no signal issues. The clock read 10:47 p.m. A cold spot lingered in the room that hadn't been there before. I decided to step outside again, mostly because staying in that quiet didn't feel right. The porch creaked under my weight as I reopened the door. The air smelled faintly metallic, like after a lightning storm, even though the sky was clear. Down the street, near the cul-de-sac, a faint pale glow pulsed once between two parked cars. It wasn't bright enough to light anything up around it. It just existed, hovering low, maybe 3 or 4 feet above the asphalt. Then it slid sideways and sank out of sight like it had dropped through the road. I walked a few steps forward, heart beating a little too hard, scanning the area. No voices, no engines, no movement except the slow sway of a hanging wind chime on my neighbor's porch. A soft vibration rolled through the ground again, lighter than the first but impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed in my hand, but when I looked, the screen was black and unresponsive for a moment before lighting up again. 10:47 p.m. The same time as before. That made me pause. I knew I'd been outside at least 5 or 6 minutes by then. I rubbed my face with my palm and tried not to let my mind spiral. Another pinpoint light streaked across the sky, not as fast as the first one. This one moved slower, controlled, like it was tracing a path rather than bursting through it. As it disappeared, the faint hum returned. My porch light flickered again. I stepped back toward the door instinctively, every sense on edge, the air feeling tight around me. The hum grew a little stronger, enough to make my teeth feel like they were barely tingling. Luna barked once from inside, sharp and nervous. Then everything dropped into silence. No bug sounds, no distant traffic, no wind. It felt like the entire neighborhood had been muted. I stood frozen, listening to my own breathing, waiting for something else to happen. The silence pressed in so thick it almost hurt. After what felt like a long minute, normal sound bled back in slowly. Crickets, leaves rustling, the faint buzz of a streetlight. The porch stopped vibrating. The air cooled slightly like a breath had passed through it. Theo arrived not long after, headlights washing over the front of the house as he pulled in. He stepped out of the car and gave me a confused look when he saw me still standing on the porch. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, though it came out too fast. "Just weird night." He noticed Luna clinging close to my legs when we went inside, her body tense in a way I'd never seen before. I didn't bother trying to explain the lights or the humming. I didn't know how to make it sound real. We went to bed later than usual. I lay there staring at the ceiling, half expecting another vibration to roll through the house. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to that faint buzzing again. It wasn't loud enough to fully shake me awake, just enough to make me aware of it. The room felt warmer than it should have, even with the fan running low. A thin glow leaked through the edges of the curtain, pale and cool. I sat up slowly and peeked through the window. The street below was empty, but a soft white point hovered above the asphalt near the end of the driveway. It wasn't moving. It wasn't illuminating anything around it. It just existed, steady and quiet. I watched it, not blinking, afraid that looking away would make it come closer somehow. After several seconds, it drifted upward, straight into the night, until it disappeared between the stars. The hum faded with it. The digital alarm clock beside the bed read 12:03 a.m. I blinked and realized only a couple minutes had passed since I'd checked it the last time before dozing off. Theo slept through all of it. By morning, everything looked normal again. No marks in the street, no damage to the porch, no loose railing. Luna finally relaxed, though she kept sniffing the front doorway area longer than usual. I went through the day on autopilot, answering emails, doing house chores, trying not to think about how the air had felt when the light had hovered outside. But every time the house went too quiet, every time the porch creaked at night, I found myself listening for that low vibration again, just faint enough to almost feel imagined. The overhead lights above the pumps flickered in a clean, repeating pattern. 3 quick pulses in perfect rhythm, then a short pause, then 3 more. It wasn't random or broken bulb kind of flicker. It felt deliberate, like someone was tapping a code through the wiring. I slowed my car as I pulled into the lot, watching the glow wash over the cracked concrete. It was close to 1:30 a.m., the kind of hour where everything felt thin and quiet. The night was cool for early spring, damp air hanging low and still, and the highway had been empty for miles. The station sat just off Route 22 outside a small stretch of farmland, a lonely little place with 1 snack aisle and 2 aging pumps that buzzed even when nobody used them. I got out and stood for a second with my keys still in my hand, listening. No wind, no cars, just the faint hum of electricity overhead. The lights pulsed again, same pattern. When I looked through the window, the cashier was already looking up. He frowned, then said under his breath, "It's back," before the lights steadied and went normal again. I pushed open the door and the stale smell of coffee and cleaner hit me. The bell chimed, sharp against the quiet. He didn't even look at me right away. He just kept staring at the ceiling like he expected it to move. "Everything okay?" I asked. He blinked and looked at me like he just remembered where he was. "Yeah, just weird wiring. Happens sometimes." It didn't sound convincing. He had a name tag that read Nelson, though he looked a bit younger than that name suggested. Maybe late 20s, tired eyes, faded hoodie. I grabbed a bottle of water and set it on the counter while he rang it up. Outside, the overhead lights flickered again, not as bright, but still synchronized, still steady. Nelson's jaw tightened. He kept his hand on the counter like he needed the balance. "How often does that happen?" I asked. "Only when it's around," he said without realizing he'd said more than he meant to. I paused. "What's around?" He gave a half shrug. "Nothing. Probably nothing. Just some issue with the line from the street. Transformer or something." I paid and stepped outside. As I unscrewed the water bottle, I noticed the quiet felt heavier than before. No insects, no distant traffic, just the soft hum above. The lights popped once more. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. I looked around the lot. Nothing moved. Beyond the pumps, the field stretched dark and flat, broken only by a few leaning fence posts and the outline of bare trees. The sky above was low and cloudy, reflecting faint orange from the nearest town miles away. I started filling my tank. The pump clicked on with a hollow whir, and that's when I noticed my phone screen go dim and bright again, as if the brightness was adjusting, but there was no notification. The time read 1:41. A slow pressure settled behind my eyes. Not pain, more like the feeling you get when a storm is about to break. Behind the building, something shifted. I glanced toward the side alley, expecting maybe a stray animal or a late truck pulling in, but the space stayed dark. No headlights, just shadow. Then, barely, the air vibrated. It wasn't sound exactly, more like a faint tremor traveling through my jaw and chest. Low, steady, brief. The pump handle felt warm in my hand. Nelson stepped outside, leaning against the doorway, his gaze scanning the lot. He didn't acknowledge me at first, just stared past the pumps like he was tracking something invisible. "You see it too sometimes?" he said. "See what?" "That flicker, when it starts acting patterned." "I just noticed it tonight." He nodded slowly. "Happened a few times this week. Always late. Always the same rhythm." Another thrum rolled through the air, subtle enough someone could miss it if they weren't paying attention. I swallowed. "What did you mean earlier when you said it's back?" Nelson let out a slow breath. "A couple nights ago, same thing happened. Lights going weird, whole building buzzing like crazy. Then every security camera glitched for about 10 seconds. Just snow. But when they came back..." He paused, rubbing his hands together. "There was something on the far edge of the lot. What kind of something? Couldn't really tell. Just a shape. Like distortion over the air. Not solid, not gas. Just wrong." The word hung between us. The lights overhead flickered again, slightly slower this time. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. My phone screen turned completely black, then lit back up again on its own, still showing the same time. Nelson straightened suddenly. "There. You feel that?" The vibration had grown slightly stronger, like a quiet engine idling somewhere close but unseen. The skin on my arms prickled as if charged. Beyond the pumps, near where the gravel met the field, the darkness didn't look normal anymore. It wasn't darker, it was smoother, almost like the space itself had flattened. Then a dull glow surfaced within it, not bright, not sharp, just pale and muted, almost milky, drifting without rhythm. Nelson stopped breathing. The glow hovered low, maybe 5 feet off the ground, moving sideways in a slow glide, no sound, no wind. The lights above us flickered in perfect sync with its motion. I felt the strangest urge to step forward and equally strong instinct not to. The glow shifted again, stretching slightly, then compressing back into a rounded shape, like it was adjusting itself to the space. Then every light over the pumps flickered at once. The vibration spiked, and the glow dissolved, thinning out until it blended with the surrounding darkness like it had never been there. Everything went still. No flicker, no hum, no pressure. Just the normal quiet of a closed highway gas station. Nelson exhaled hard and placed both hands on his knees. "That's exactly like before," he muttered. I noticed my tank had stopped pumping even though it wasn't full. The screen on the pump displayed a frozen number. "Does it ever come closer?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not so far. It just shows up, messes with the power, then leaves." I glanced at the field again, half expecting it to swell back into view. Nothing. The building lights returned to their usual steady glow. The buzzing faded into normal background noise. My phone settled, screen bright and responsive again. I forced a laugh that didn't feel like it belonged to me. Probably just some weird electrical fault. Moisture in the lines or something. "Maybe," he said, not sounding convinced. I finished filling manually and returned the pump. As I climbed back into my car, I couldn't shake the sense that something had been aware of us standing there, like the space itself had paused to observe before continuing on. I checked the time again once inside. 1:41 a.m. It hadn't moved since before the lights first flickered. When I pulled back onto the road and glanced in my rearview mirror, the station stood quiet and normal, glowing softly against the empty night, as if nothing strange had ever passed through it at all. I saw the glow under the water before I realized how fast it was moving. It slid beneath my skiff like a pale band of light, smooth and steady, cutting through the dark surface far quicker than any boat ever could. I stopped reeling in and leaned over the side, trying to figure out if I was seeing reflection from something onshore or just a weird trick of moonlight. There was no moon. The sky above the bayou was low and gray, heavy with early morning cloud cover, the kind that made everything feel flat and quiet. It had rained overnight, and the air still smelled damp, warm, thick with mud and cypress. I'd been out since just before 5, same as most mornings, drifting along the bend near Lake Verret where the water went darker and deep. My name's Jared Cormier, and I'd been fishing these spots for most of my life. I knew the wake patterns, the way submerged logs caught light, the difference between a passing gar and something deeper moving slow under the boat. This wasn't any of that. The glow moved again, faster this time, straight toward the center of the channel, then curved back on itself like it was pacing something. I reached for the flashlight clipped to my cooler, thumb hovering over the button, still trying to reason it out. Then I switched it on. The beam cut across the surface, and the glowing shape vanished instantly. Not faded, not blurred, just gone. The water went flat and black, perfectly still like a piece of glass. I waited for ripples, for anything. Nothing moved. I stood there for a long second with the light still aimed down, the beam reflecting off dead leaves and silt below. I shut it off, and the darkness settled in again. "Probably just a school of something," I muttered, though my voice sounded thin even to me. I went back to my line, though the calm didn't feel normal anymore. It was too quiet, not even frogs calling from the reeds like usual, no insects, just the soft slap of water against the boat as it drifted. A few minutes passed, then the glow returned. This time it came from the other side of the boat, pushing a faint shimmer across the underside of the surface, like light passing through moving glass. It picked up speed in a way that didn't match current or tide. It circled once, quick and precise, then shot straight ahead, disappearing into the dark water past the reach of my eyes. My stomach tightened. I flicked the flashlight on again, sweeping left to right. Still nothing. The light didn't bounce off anything solid. No floating debris, no foam trail, no wake pattern I recognized. When I turned the light off, the surface remained calm, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. That's when I noticed the temperature change. The air around me felt warmer, like a pocket of humidity had settled low over the boat. My arms prickled and the fine hairs along my neck stood up. I could have sworn there was a faint vibration under the hull, subtle enough to doubt but persistent enough to feel. I checked my phone, not for signal, just for the time. 5:37 a.m. I started the motor and nudged the skiff a few feet forward, easing away from the spot where I'd seen it. The engine sounded louder than usual in the quiet, echoing across the water. I slowed again after a few yards, cutting power to listen. A small swirl rippled the surface off my right. Then the glow snapped back into view. It moved so fast this time it looked like a streak, a soft line of dull white slicing beneath the surface, racing parallel to the boat. It shifted direction sharply, no gradual curve, just an abrupt change, like it didn't care about resistance. It didn't feel natural. I leaned over again, despite every instinct telling me not to. "Hey!" I called out, not knowing who or what I was addressing. The glow slowed slightly, hovering beneath an area just past the bow. The water above it turned lighter, almost silvery, as if reflecting a light source that wasn't there. Slowly, like it was testing the space, it moved closer to the surface. I could make out a vague shape now, not sharp or clear, but rounded, smooth, something solid under the shimmer. It was larger than a fish, wider than any turtle or alligator I'd ever seen pass under this boat. The air felt heavy. I switched the flashlight on again. Instantly, everything went dark and still. The glow snapped off mid-motion, and the water lay flat again, as if the second before never happened. No wake, no ripple, no trace it had ever been there. My heartbeat thudded loud in my ears. I shut the light off and stared into the black, waiting. For a split second, I thought it was over. Then a quiet tremor rippled beneath the boat. Just once, subtle enough that I could have convinced myself it was engine movement if the motor hadn't been dead still. I didn't see the glow again after that. Not then. I stayed frozen in place for maybe another minute, eyes scanning the surface, trying to piece together what any of it meant. My nerves were tight in a way that felt strange, almost deliberate, like the tension had been placed there, not earned. Eventually, I restarted the engine and slowly turned back toward shore. The trip felt longer than usual, even though the terrain didn't change. The sky lightened into a dull silver as morning crept in, but none of the usual sounds returned. No birds, no distant boats, just the low rumble of the motor and the quiet slap of water beneath me. Halfway back, I saw another ripple ahead. Then the glow flashed one last time, far under the surface, deeper than before, moving so quickly it left no wake at all. It streaked past the underside of the boat, vanished near the bank, and didn't come back. When I reached the dock and tied off, everything around me felt normal again. The air cooled slightly. The insects started humming. A heron lifted off from the reeds with a lazy beat of wings. I stood on the dock and watched the water for a few more minutes, waiting for it to break again, for anything to show itself. It stayed perfectly still. I packed my gear, loaded the skiff, and headed home through the lingering mist, still unsure of what I'd seen, only certain of how wrong it had felt and how quickly the bayou had gone back to pretending it hadn't happened at all. The night dropped into silence so fast it felt like someone flipped a switch. 1 second, there were crickets, wind in the grass, the faint rush of air through my open windows, and then there was nothing. No background noise at all. Just my tires humming on the pavement and my own breathing. I was driving a narrow back road outside of Pine Ridge, the stretch that ran between open fields and half-forgotten farmhouses. It was late, around 11:45, and the air had that heavy summer stickiness to it, the kind that made your skin feel slightly damp, even with the breeze from the car. I had the radio off and both windows down because the air felt better that way, or at least it had until everything went quiet. At first, I thought maybe my ears had popped or something. I clicked my tongue, shook my head, turned the radio on, and back off. The silence stayed unnaturally clean, like the world had been muted. That's when I noticed the clicking. It didn't come from the road or inside the car. It sounded higher, like it was coming from somewhere above the tree line. A soft, rhythmic tick, 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 spaced evenly apart. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I glanced up through the windshield, half expecting to see a helicopter or some drone hovering, but the sky was dark and cloudless. No blinking lights, no navigation beams. Just a spread of dim stars and the faint glow from distant town lights. The clicking continued. I eased my foot off the gas without really meaning to. The speedometer crept down as I rolled forward, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It didn't echo. It didn't change volume. It just stayed perfectly consistent, like it wasn't affected by distance at all. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The hair on my arm stood up, even though the night was warm. Okay, I muttered to myself, more out of habit than comfort. The road curved slightly, and my headlights swept across a long stretch of weeds and a rusted cattle gate. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The clicking grew slightly louder, not in a dramatic way, just enough that I became more aware of it, like realizing someone was standing behind you without turning around. I slowed to almost a crawl. The silence around it felt dense, almost padded, like sound wasn't allowed to travel anymore. Then the clicking stopped. The sudden absence of it made my chest feel hollow. I held my breath without realizing it, listening hard for anything else. Still nothing. No insects returning, no wind, just that same unnatural quiet. And then the silence shattered. The crickets burst back to life all at once, so loud and chaotic it almost made me flinch. The breeze flooded into the car again. Leaves rustled. Night sounds returned like someone had opened a door, but something still felt wrong. The air pressure inside the car felt different, heavier somehow. My chest tightened as I glanced overhead again. That's when I saw it. Not directly. It was more like noticing a shape where a shape shouldn't exist. A faint, dark distortion gliding across the sky, barely visible, like heat shimmer, but smoother. It moved slowly, not matching the direction of any breeze. I watched it pass over a cluster of stars, softly warping them as it moved. Then the clicking started again. Tick, tick, tick. This time it felt closer. My heartbeat picked up, and I gripped the wheel harder, knuckles pale. My mind kept trying to label it as something normal. Electrical interference, random mechanical noise, brain glitch, but none of those explained the way the sound came from above, or how the sky itself seemed slightly wrong. The distortion shifted direction without any visible turning, gliding sideways like it wasn't obeying the usual rules of movement. My phone buzzed faintly in the cup holder. I glanced down. No notification, just the screen lighting up like it had woken itself. The time read 11:47. I could have sworn it had been nearly midnight a moment ago. The clicking softened again, then fell into silence. I looked back up. The sky looked normal. No distortion, no movement, just the usual blank darkness. But the road ahead wasn't right. My headlights illuminated the same fence line and tree grouping I had already passed at least 10 minutes earlier. The crooked mailbox, the leaning utility pole, the same cracked strip of asphalt with faded paint. I knew this stretch. I had grown up driving it. I turned around slightly in my seat, checking behind me. The road curved away into darkness exactly as it should. Confused, I checked my phone clock again, 11:47. It hadn't moved. A strange, heavy calm settled in my chest. Not relief, but the kind of quiet you feel before you understand something is wrong. I drove forward again, slow and careful, eyes scanning both sides of the road and the sky above. A faint shimmer drifted over the tree line once more, barely noticeable unless you focused directly on it. The clicking returned, lower this time, closer. I stopped the car completely. The engine idled softly. My breath felt loud in my ears. The distortion hovered, almost directly above the road now, as if it had positioned itself to watch. No sound, but the faint, steady ticking. My hands trembled slightly against the wheel. I whispered, "What are you?" Even though I didn't really expect an answer. There wasn't one. Instead, the clicking quickened for 3 beats, then stopped again. The silence slammed down like a curtain. A pressure washed over my ears, not painful, just heavy. Then everything snapped back. Cicadas buzzed, wind rolled through the grass. My car engine hummed normally. The shimmer vanished like it had never been there. I checked my phone again. 11:58. I blinked, staring at the screen, then out at the road, then back again. I hadn't moved more than a few feet since stopping. My gas gauge hadn't changed. My hands still gripped the wheel in the same position. Nothing around me looked disturbed. I pulled slowly back onto the road, heart still racing. The normal night sounds almost too loud now. Every few seconds I glanced upward, waiting for the clicking to return. It didn't. When I finally reached the edge of town and the first streetlights came into view, the air started to feel normal again, like the world had reset itself. But the sense that something had been there, calmly observing, never left my mind. Driving the rest of the way home, the only sound was the hum of my tires and the whisper of wind through the open windows, and the quiet awareness that the silence had belonged to something else entirely. I was walking the gravel path along Pritchard Creek when the fog swallowed everything past a few yards. It was one of those early mornings where the air felt damp enough to stick to your clothes. I had my hood up, hands in my pockets, just trying to clear my head before work. Then I saw the lights. They hovered ahead of me at eye level, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, a small cluster of dim pale dots hanging in the fog. Not bright like headlights, not blinking, just steady and soft like battery lights that had been left on too long. I slowed without thinking. My shoes crunched softly on the gravel, the sound swallowed by the thick air. The lights looked like they belonged to something standing there, but there was no outline, no shape, nothing but fog and those faint points. I stopped moving. The lights didn't. They stayed exactly where they were, as if they had been placed there instead of floating. My heart beat harder, not from panic yet, just that uneasy feeling when something didn't fit. I shifted my weight, and the gravel clicked under my heel. The lights stayed still. No sway, no drift. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling stupid. No answer came back, just the quiet of fog and the faint drip of water from trees along the creek. I took another slow step forward. The lights looked closer now, but I couldn't tell if that was real or just the way fog warped distance. A breeze moved through the path, and the fog thinned slightly. In that moment, the lights rose straight up, smooth and silent, like they were being lifted on an invisible string. They climbed into the gray and vanished. I stood there, staring at the empty space where they had been, my mouth slightly open. The air felt colder for a second. I waited. Nothing else happened. The fog closed back in, and the clear spot filled again, like whatever I saw had never been there. I shook my head and started walking again, slower now, eyes scanning every direction. A few minutes passed. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't that weird out here, but I usually at least had one bar. It said 6:12 a.m. I could have sworn it had been earlier. My steps sounded too loud in the quiet. Somewhere to my left, a bird cried out and then went silent. The creek made a low, steady trickle beside the path, but even that sounded farther away than it should have. As I walked, the fog thickened again, wrapping around the trees and low brush. The world shrank to a bubble of damp air and shadow. That's when I noticed a faint reflection on the wet gravel, like a weak shimmer that didn't match the dull light of the overcast sky. I looked up and saw another faint glow, different from before, wider this time and more spread out, hovering just above the bushes off the side of the trail. It didn't move. It didn't pulse. It just existed. I froze again. My name is Caleb Mora, and I'm not the kind of person who jumps at every little thing. I grew up hunting, camping, walking trails before sunrise. I knew what night looked like and what fog did to light. This wasn't any of that. The glow shifted slightly, like a slow breath. I swallowed and stepped back. The crunch of gravel echoed too sharply. The glow didn't move. It didn't react. I pulled my phone out and tried to record, but the camera only showed white blur, no faint light at all. A low hum started to fill the air. It wasn't loud. It was more like a vibration you felt in your chest than heard. My jacket brushed against my arms as a thin breeze passed over me, smelling slightly metallic, like rain on old pipes. The glow dimmed, then returned, then dimmed again. Behind me, somewhere on the path, I heard a soft footstep. Just one. I turned quickly. Nothing was there. My heart thumped harder now. I turned back toward the light and noticed it had shifted closer to the ground, like it was lowering itself. The hum deepened slightly. I felt stupid standing there, but I couldn't make myself move. Every instinct I had told me to leave, and my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then the glow blinked out. Not faded, not drifted. Just gone. In its place, the bushes looked normal again. Wet leaves, dark branches, fog. The hum stopped at the same instant. I stood there breathing hard, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. Nothing answered back. The world settled into an uncomfortable stillness. I checked my phone again. 6:27 a.m. 15 minutes had passed, and it felt like maybe 5. I forced my feet to move, turning back toward the trailhead. Each step felt heavy, like the ground resisted me. The fog didn't clear. If anything, it thickened, curling around my legs as if it had weight. Halfway back, the sound of my footsteps changed. The gravel crunch no longer matched my pace. It sounded like something behind me was stepping slightly out of sync. I stopped. The crunch stopped too. I turned slowly. Still no one there. My breath looked thicker in the air now. The fog swirled softly around my shoulders. A few yards ahead, another dim cluster of lights appeared, lower than before, nearly touching the path. 3 small points, arranged unevenly, floating just above the gravel. They didn't resemble eyes. They didn't resemble any tool or gear I could think of. They were just there. The air buzzed faintly again, that low vibration coming back. I stood frozen as the lights drifted sideways, slow and smooth, keeping the same distance from me as I shifted my stance. They moved like they were watching, measuring. I whispered, "No," though I wasn't sure who I was saying it to. The fog rolled in a sudden wave, briefly blocking them. When it slid away, the lights shot straight up once more and vanished into the gray ceiling above the trees. The hum lingered a second longer, then cut off clean. Everything returned to the normal sounds of morning. A crow called somewhere far off. The faint rustle of leaves came back. My shoes scraped lightly when I stepped back. I didn't look behind me again. I just walked faster until the path opened back onto the parking area where my car sat waiting, covered in thin dew. When I climbed inside and shut the door, the world felt solid again, like I had crossed an invisible line. I sat there, breathing for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the fog roll past the windshield. My phone antenna ticked back to life. 1 bar, then 2. The time read 6:31 a.m. I drove away slowly, eyes scanning the rearview mirror, half expecting to see pale dots hovering on the edge of the road. There was nothing, just fog and wet pavement stretching back into quiet light. I woke up because the whole house was vibrating lightly, the way it does when a semi passes too close on the highway, except it was softer and constant, like a low tremor running through the floorboards. The headboard rattled faintly against the wall. My bedside lamp gave a tiny clink sound every few seconds. I lay there for a moment trying to figure out if I was still dreaming, but the vibration kept going. I sat up and checked the clock. It said 2:46 a.m. The air in the room felt warmer than it should have, even though the windows were cracked open. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The vibration stayed steady, not getting worse, not fading. I walked to the hallway and glanced toward the front door. The house creaked in small ways like usual, but something about the quiet felt wrong. No distant cars, no wind against the siding, just that low hum through the floor. I moved to the living room window and pulled the curtain aside. The street outside was empty. No headlights, no passing truck, no flashing lights, nothing. The pavement looked slightly damp under the street lamp, but there had been no recent rain. I smelled something faint in the air, sharp and strange, almost like hot metal or old coins. It didn't belong to anything familiar. Not gas, not plastic, something colder. I opened the window a bit more, and the vibration rolled through my hands where they touched the frame. The night was still. No breeze, no engine sound. Just silence wrapped around that low, shuddering pulse. My neighbor's house across the street sat dark and quiet. The miller's old oak tree wasn't moving at all. Even the wind chimes on Mrs. Hernandez's porch were completely motionless. The vibration suddenly shifted slightly, like it deepened for a second, then returned to the same rhythm. My stomach tightened. I stepped back from the window and grabbed my phone. No notifications, no weather alerts, no power outage. Everything looked normal. I walked down the short hallway toward the kitchen and noticed the silverware in the drying rack was faintly buzzing, like it was responding to the same tremor. The glass cups trembled just enough to make a soft clicking noise. "Hello?" I muttered, knowing no one would answer. The house felt occupied, even though I was alone. I put my hand flat against the wall and felt the hum traveling through it, faint but unmistakable. The smell lingered, that metallic edge, like the air had been charged. I moved toward the front door and placed my hand on the knob. It felt slightly warm, which didn't make sense either. I hesitated, then opened it slowly. The porch light flicked on automatically and washed pale yellow over the front steps. Outside, the night was empty. No movement, no sound, just the same vibration humming under everything. I stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards felt alive under my bare feet, buzzing lightly. The air carried that electric metal smell stronger now. I scanned the road from left to right. Still nothing. Then I noticed the sky looked off. Not dark exactly, but tinted, like a dull sheen had been brushed across it. The stars were faded, not gone, just muted under a thin, grayish cast. It didn't look like clouds. It looked heavy. The vibration gently increased again, just a hair stronger, and the porch railing shivered in my hands. I whispered my sister's name out of habit, Mel. No response came, which made sense. She didn't live here. The quiet felt deeper suddenly, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Behind me, inside the house, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard, even though no one else was there. I turned slowly. The hallway looked the same as always, the open bedroom door, the dim outline of the couch, the shadow of the ceiling fan. Nothing visibly wrong. I stepped back inside and shut the door. The vibration continued through the floor as my feet crossed the threshold. My phone buzzed suddenly, not a message, just a brief flicker, then the screen went dark. When I tapped it awake again, the time read 3:09 a.m. That made no sense. It had been 2:46 not that long ago. I stood there staring at the screen, then glanced back toward the door. The hum deepened again, and for a second it felt like it rose through my chest, pressing gently against my ribs. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went still. No vibration, no hum, nothing. The house settled with a tiny crack of wood relaxing. The air felt normal again. The metallic smell softened and faded like it had never been there. I waited, listening. My ears strained for any sign it might come back, but the night gave me nothing. Just normal silence, soft and ordinary. I walked back to the window and looked out at the road again. Still empty, still calm. When I turned away, I noticed my kitchen clock blinking 12, even though the power hadn't gone out. I reset it slowly, hands shaking a bit more than I liked. I went back to my bedroom but didn't crawl under the covers right away. I stood by the doorway, watching the faint outline of the ceiling move with my breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Eventually, I sat on the edge of the bed and checked my phone again. 3:12 a.m. No missed calls, no alerts, no evidence anything strange had occurred. But the house still felt unsettled, like a quiet after an argument no one finished. I lay down and tried to slow my breathing. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small creak made my eyes snap open. Every tiny sound made me tense up. At some point, my body gave in and drifted off. When morning light filtered in through the blinds, everything looked normal. No vibration, no smell, just my familiar little house and the quiet street beyond it. Still, when I walked out to get the mail, I noticed faint marks in the dew on the driveway that didn't resemble footprints or tire tracks. Just shallow, circular impressions, spaced strangely far apart, like something had hovered low and paused for a moment. They had already started to fade by the time I stared at them long enough to notice. The dashcam clock read 5:18 p.m. when the light first showed up, and I wouldn't have even noticed it if my buddy Jericho hadn't said, "Man, did you see that?" from the passenger seat. We were driving along Route 113 outside of Red Valley. That long stretch where the land rolls into low, dry hills and the only buildings are scattered barns and wind-worn fences. The sun was starting to dip and the sky had that dusty orange look you get before dusk. It was still warm, still dry, the kind of quiet afternoon where you could drive for miles and barely pass another car. I'd had the dash cam running like always. My sister Lena had convinced me to install it after someone sideswiped her and took off last year. I never really thought much about it beyond forgetting to clear the SD card every few weeks. Jericho pointed toward the left side of the windshield, just past the low ridge line. I glanced over and saw a bright flare, like a sudden strip of white fire dropping down behind one of the hills. It moved fast, but not like a meteor. It dipped steadily, then vanished out of sight past the earth. "What was that?" I asked, slowing down without really thinking. "Looked like something falling," Jericho said, squinting at the horizon, "but no sound." I rolled the window down slightly. No crackle, no distant boom, no echo. Just dry air pushing past my face and the low hum of my tires on worn pavement. We kept driving, both of us quieter than before. Jericho kept craning his neck, like he expected something to rise back up. I caught a faint flash again about a minute later. Smaller this time, deeper behind the hills like a dull flicker where it had gone down. Neither of us said anything. By the time we reached the Old Morales Farm Road turnoff, the sky had settled back into normal colors. We shrugged it off the way you do when something doesn't add up, but you don't want to make a big deal of it. We talked about grabbing food in town and forgot about the light. It wasn't until later that night, back at my place, that it started to bother me again. I'd dropped Jericho off and driven home alone, the road darker now with only the occasional ranch lights scattered in the distance. The quiet felt heavier than usual. Every time my headlights swept over a hill, I half expected to see that flare again. Inside, I made a sandwich and sat at my kitchen table scrolling through my phone. The image of that falling white streak kept replaying in my head, so I figured I might as well check the dash cam. I grabbed my laptop and popped the SD card in. The footage loaded fast. I skipped ahead to around the time it happened. 5:17 p.m., clear road, normal scenery. Then the timestamp rolled to 5:18. The screen suddenly went pure white. Not blur, not glare, just a blank, overexposed frame like someone had held a light directly against the lens. It stayed that way for a little over 3 seconds, then snapped back to normal road footage like nothing had happened. But there was no visible flare, no descending light, no streak, just white emptiness. I scrolled back and played it again. Same thing, normal road, then a bright wash of white. Then the dash cam returning to normal just in time to show the hill we'd been looking toward. My stomach dropped a little. I leaned closer to the screen, like that would somehow reveal something hidden in it. I adjusted contrast, replayed frame by frame. Nothing changed. The exact moment I remembered staring at that flare was replaced with blank brightness. I muted the laptop and sat back, suddenly aware of how quiet my house felt. I texted Jericho. "You remember that light we saw earlier?" He replied a minute later. "Yeah, weirdest thing." "Why?" I told him about the dashcam footage. He sent a single "huh," then followed it with a laughing emoji, probably trying to lighten it up, but I didn't feel like laughing. I shut the laptop and tried to distract myself with the TV, but every little creak in the house pulled my attention away. Around 11 p.m., I gave up and went outside onto my back porch to cool off. The night was clear but dry, with a soft breeze brushing across the fields behind my property. The moon hung low and pale. I looked out toward the same stretch of hills from earlier, barely visible in the distance. The air felt heavier somehow, not stormy, just dense. I stood there a long time, hands on the railing, listening to crickets and distant coyotes. Then, faintly, the same spot where the flare had dropped glowed again, barely visible, and a pale shimmer clinging to the horizon like a memory of light rather than actual brightness. It didn't fall this time. It just hovered low and dim for a few seconds before fading into the night. My chest tightened. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched. When the glow vanished, everything went dark again. Just fields, hills, and silence. Inside, I locked the door without really meaning to. I checked the dashcam again just to be sure. The footage still showed nothing but white where the flare should have been. The next morning, I drove out that way again, alone this time. The road felt different, even in broad daylight. Like I was passing through somewhere I wasn't supposed to see clearly. Nothing looked disturbed. No burn marks, no smoke, no strange debris, just dry earth and yellowed grass swaying lazily on the slope. I parked on the side of the road and stepped out, walking up the ridge a bit. The dirt was warm under my shoes. I scanned the ground for anything unusual and noticed a small patch where the grass had bent down in a circular shape, like something heavy had pressed there and lifted back off again. No footprints, no scraping, just flattened blades slowly trying to stand back upright. I stared at it until my neck started aching. When I got back into my car, my dash cam briefly flickered on and off, almost like it didn't want to be recording. I watched the hills one last time before driving home, half expecting that bright flare to return, but the sky stayed simple and ordinary. No streaks, no shimmer, just open space pretending nothing had ever happened. The radio cut to static right as my tires hit the start of the bridge, a sharp hiss that swallowed the soft country song I'd been half listening to. I tapped the volume knob out of habit, thinking I just drifted out of range again, but the static flattened into a low, steady hum. Not music, not talking, just one long, even tone. It was close to midnight, and I was crossing the old Callahan Bridge outside of Riverton, the one that stretched over Blackwater Creek and the marsh beyond it. There were no streetlights on that stretch, just my headlights and the occasional reflective marker on the guardrail. The night felt heavy and damp, the kind where the air stuck to your skin. It had rained earlier in the evening, and the boards of the bridge still looked dark and wet. I glanced down at the radio, expecting it to switch back like it usually did. It stayed on that hum. It's almost like someone was holding a note somewhere very far away. "What are you doing?" I muttered, leaning forward and twisting the dial. The hum didn't change. AM, FM, auxiliary, all the same low vibration. Then, I looked over the passenger window. Below the bridge, the creek was barely visible, just a flat stretch of black water with faint ripples catching the headlights. That's when I noticed the glow. It wasn't bright, just a soft pale shape sliding under the surface, like someone had drawn a streak of light and erased it mid-motion. It moved slow and smooth, not splashing or churning, just drifting along beneath the water in a way that didn't look right. I eased my foot off the gas without really thinking, watching it pass under my side of the bridge. The hum on the radio didn't change, but I could feel it now, not just hear it, a faint vibration in my fingertips on the steering wheel. The shape glowed a little brighter for maybe 2 seconds. Long, faded at the edges. I couldn't tell what it was, only that it moved with a purpose that felt wrong for the creek. Then it dimmed and slipped into darkness. The moment it vanished, the hum cut out and the radio popped back to the country song, right where it had left off. No static, no warning, just normal sound again. I didn't touch anything. I drove the rest of the bridge in silence, had music still playing but feeling wrong now, like background noise in a place that shouldn't have any. When I finally reached the other side, I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and turned the engine off. The night felt too quiet. Even the crickets seemed distant. I sat there staring back at the bridge, half expecting the glow to show again, but the water looked plain and dark. My phone buzzed. A message from my cousin Lacey asking if I'd made it home yet. I told her I was fine, just driving slow. I didn't mention the bridge. I didn't really know how to explain it without sounding off. After a few minutes, I started the car again and headed home, trying to shake the feeling that something had passed too close to me without touching. The next morning, I woke up thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Late night, tired eyes, wet roads, that was the easiest answer. Still, memory of that hum and the quiet glow wouldn't leave me alone. So around noon, I drove back out to the bridge. In daylight, it looked normal. Rusted metal supports, tired wooden planks, brown water drifting lazily underneath. I stood at the rail for a while, scanning the surface. No light, no motion beyond the slow current. I leaned slightly over, peering down, and caught a faint shimmer far below, like a reflection that didn't match the sun. It moved for a split second and then vanished again, as if it had only been there when I wasn't trying to see it. I stepped back, heart tapping a little faster than it should have. Later that night, it happened again. I found myself on the bridge around the same time, even though I didn't remember choosing that road. The sky was darker this time, clouds hiding every star. The air felt cooler, heavier. My tires rolled over the same wet boards I remembered from the night before. The radio stayed silent for most of the drive, but as soon as I reached the center of the bridge, the hum returned. Clearer this time. Deeper. It filled the inside of the car so completely it felt like a layer pressing down. I didn't touch anything. I just stared straight ahead, pulse ticking behind my ears. This time, the glow appeared on the opposite side, closer to the surface. A wider shape now, fainter around the edges, but undeniably there. It glided slow as if it were tracing the length of the bridge itself. I watched it move alongside me, matching my speed as I crept forward without realizing I'd slowed again. The sense of being watched crept in slowly, like a cold line down my back. Not from above, not from the road, from the water. The glow pulsed once, soft and steady, then dipped lower and disappeared again, leaving the surface untouched. No ripples, no sound. The radio went quiet immediately after. I exhaled and kept driving until I reached the other side, as hands tight on the wheel. I made it home and sat in my driveway for a long time, just listening to the normal night sounds. Frogs, wind through the trees, a distant dog barking. Everything felt normal again, but my skin still buzzed faintly like the hum left behind a memory of itself. I slept lightly, waking a few times to check if I could hear anything outside. Only silence. Over the next few days, I avoided that bridge without intentionally deciding to. I took longer routes, drove out of my way just to not pass over it. Every time my radio crackled a little or the road went quiet, my stomach tightened. A week later, I had no choice but to cross it again. A detour forced me that way after a delivery run, and the sky had turned overcast early, pressing low and gray. The air smelled like rain. As I approached the bridge, the radio didn't hum. No static, just ordinary talk show voices. I almost felt ridiculous for feeling anxious. Halfway across, the voices twisted suddenly into faint white noise. Then that same steady tone seeped through low and slow. I didn't look down right away. When I finally did, the water was calm, dark, empty. No glow this time, no shape, just shadow. But the hum stayed, strong and even, filling the car until I reached the far end. Then it vanished as soon as my tires rolled onto dry pavement. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a faint glimmer under the bridge, barely visible, like a distant reflection fading into nothing. I kept driving. I didn't stop. And when I reached home, I locked the door and stood in the quiet for a while, listening to the normal sounds of my house. The creek stayed quiet after that, but every time my radio dropped into static for even a second, I felt that low hum echo in my chest, like the water hadn't quite let go of me yet. I stood in the middle of the field behind my brother's place, boots sinking slightly into the damp grass, just looking up because I couldn't sleep. The air felt cool but not cold, thick with the leftover smell of cut hay and wet soil. It was quiet out there, the kind of quiet that made every small sound stand out. A cricket chirping, a distant dog barking somewhere down the road, the low hum of a transformer a mile away. I tilted my head back and watched the sky, trying to follow the familiar clusters of stars my dad used to point out when I was a kid. I'd always liked the way the night stretched open over that field, like the rest of the world shrank down to nothing. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, breathing slow. That's when I noticed it. The stars shifted. Not faded, not streaked like a satellite or plane. They moved, just a little, like someone had nudged them sideways. Maybe a few inches from where they should have been, as if the whole sky bent for a second like fabric being pulled. I squinted, thinking maybe I'd blinked weird or my eyes were tired. Then, just as smoothly, they snapped back into place. Everything above looked normal again. I lowered my head, heart tapping faster now, and glanced around the field like something on the ground might explain what I'd just seen. Nothing had changed down here. The tall grass still leaned slightly with the breeze. The fence on the far end still creaked softly as it always did. "You saw that, right?" I muttered, even though I was alone. I looked back up, half expecting it to happen again. The stars stayed frozen where they should be, but the sense that something had moved lingered in my chest. I waited. A breeze rolled across the field, brushing past my arms, cool and oddly damp. I remember thinking it smelled faintly metallic, like pennies or wet iron, but I shrugged it off. The night felt heavier now, like the air had thickened. I started walking slowly toward the center of the field, eyes never leaving the sky. Every step felt deliberate, like I didn't want to disturb whatever had just happened. Then, off to the left, I noticed a faint, dim patch against the stars. At first, it looked like a cloud, but the forecast had been clear. The patch didn't glow. It didn't drift. It just sat there, slightly darker than the rest, as if something wide and thin was hanging between me and the sky. I stopped again, breath shallow. The patch moved, almost imperceptibly, sliding across the stars like a shadow with no source. And when it passed, the stars behind it bent slightly, like ripples through glass. My mouth felt dry. I pulled my phone out and lifted it, trying to get a picture, but the moment the screen lit up, the dark patch faded and the sky snapped back to perfect normal. I stared at the picture after, but it was just stars. Clean, ordinary stars. "Okay," I whispered, stomach tight. "Okay." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood still, listening. The field had gone oddly quiet. I realized the crickets had stopped, like someone hit a mute switch. Even the distant highway noise seemed farther away. The air vibrated faintly, not enough to hear, more like a sensation in my jaw and teeth, like standing too close to a subwoofer. It came in slow waves, barely there, but persistent. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tall grass around me. The darkness between the rows looked deeper than it should. Every shadow seemed longer now. Then I noticed my own shadow stretching ahead of me, even though there was no moon bright enough to cast it that sharply. It looked warped, the edges flickering slightly, as if it didn't quite know where to settle. I took a cautious step forward. My shadow stayed behind for a moment longer than it should have, then slid into place again. I stopped breathing for a second, feeling a pulse of fear creep into my throat. The vibration in the air faded slowly, like something moving farther away. The crickets began again, one by one, awkward and unsure, then full and steady. I forced myself to keep walking, heading back toward the farmhouse lights at the edge of the field. Every few steps I looked up, scanning the stars, waiting for another shift. Nothing happened. But the longer I walked, the more it felt like someone was standing just beyond my vision, off to one side, matching my pace. I kept almost glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a silhouette or some distant glow. The field stayed empty. When I finally reached the edge, I looked back one last time. For a second, I thought the stars shifted again, just barely, like the sky took a breath. Then it corrected itself so fast I wasn't sure if it had happened at all. Inside the house, the warmth felt unreal. I poured myself a glass of water, but didn't drink it right away. My hands were still unsteady. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the exact way the stars had moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just wrong enough to notice. The next evening, out of some mix of curiosity and stubbornness, I walked back to the field just before sunset. The sky glowed soft orange and purple, peaceful and normal. I stood there as the stars slowly began to appear. I watched carefully. Nothing moved. But every now and then, just at the edge of my sight, it felt like the whole sky leaned a little, like a curtain catching a breeze, only to settle again before I could prove it. I walked Mason down the paved path behind the old industrial park, the one that ran along the abandoned rail line and out toward the low fields that sloped down to the river. It was late evening, the kind where the sky wasn't fully dark yet, but the sun had already given up. The air felt damp and slightly muggy, like it hadn't decided whether it wanted to cool off or not. Mason pulled a little ahead of me, nose low, sniffing every patch of grass like his life depended on it. I let him wander since there was no one else around. The warehouses were all dark, windows reflecting the dull orange of the fading sky. I noticed the first flash without really understanding what I was seeing. It came from the far horizon, just above the fields where the ground dropped away. A thin pulse of pale light rippled sideways, moving left to right like a wave rolling across the sky. It wasn't bright enough to fully light anything up, but it was distinct, clean, smooth, like it followed an invisible line. I slowed down, watching it disappear into the edge of the coming dark. "What was that?" I muttered, mostly to Mason. He'd stopped entirely, body stiff, ears angled forward. The leash went tight, but he didn't move. He just stared toward the horizon, head low, throat making a quiet rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. I tugged gently. "Come on, man." He didn't respond. Another pulse rolled across the same spot, perfectly horizontal, same height, same direction. It traveled steady and even, not fast, not slow. It reminded me of a scanner line or something passing over a surface, but there wasn't anything there except distant trees and the barely visible outline of a grain silo. Mason's tail tucked down. He dug in his paws like he was bracing against a strong wind, even though the air around us stayed still. "All right," I said, forcing some calm into my voice. "We can turn back." But even when I tried stepping backward, Mason refused to budge. He kept staring, chest moving fast. His eyes tracked the horizon like he was waiting for it to happen again. And then it did. This time the pulse looked a little thicker, like two waves overlapping. It passed across the sky smoothly and vanished beyond the tree line. The silence that followed felt wrong. No bugs, no distant highway. Even the faint hum from the power substation had dropped out. I swallowed and crouched to Mason's level, resting a hand on his back. His fur felt rigid and bristled just slightly. "You okay?" I whispered, even though I already knew he wasn't. The air shifted again. A strange pressure settled around us like the moment right before a storm hits. The smell changed too, faint and metallic, like wet wire or old coins. Somewhere down the path to the right, gravel crunched softly, but when I turned, no one was there. The path remained empty, stretching between dead weeds and cracked asphalt. I looked back toward the horizon, afraid and curious in the same breath. The pulse returned, brighter this time, and for a split second it lit the edges of the far tree line in a dull, washed-out white. It didn't move like lightning or a spotlight. It passed in a perfectly straight line, smooth and controlled, then vanished again. Mason whimpered quietly, throat tight. "I don't like this," I murmured. I finally managed to get him to take a cautious step back when I pulled a little firmer on the leash. He resisted, but his eyes flicked briefly toward me, then back to the horizon. His body stayed tense, like every instinct in him said not to move. Another pulse came, weaker than before, and then nothing. The pressure faded slowly. The bugs returned, one by one at first, then full and ordinary again. The distant hum of the city crept back in. I didn't wait for it to happen again. I turned fully and started walking back toward the parking lot. Mason followed, but kept glancing over his shoulder, ears twitching with every sound. Halfway back, I noticed the sky had darkened more than it should have for the amount of time that passed. My phone said only 10 minutes had gone by, but it felt longer. Or maybe shorter. I couldn't tell. By the time we reached the car, my hands felt cold even though the evening stayed warm. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, just breathing, staring out over the fields through the windshield. The horizon looked normal again. Dark silhouettes, quiet sky, no pulses, no movement. Mason curled up on the floorboard, but his head stayed lifted, eyes never fully relaxing. On the drive home, I kept thinking I saw a faint light flicker in the rearview mirror, but every time I checked, it was just the empty road and distant farmhouses. When we got back to the house, Mason hesitated at the porch steps, nose raised, sniffing the air like he was testing it for something unfamiliar. He only came inside after I coaxed him. Later, standing at the kitchen window, I watched the dark settle over the neighborhood. Everything looked ordinary again, calm, safe, but somewhere past the houses, beyond the trees and field lines, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made that light wasn't done moving. My headlights caught it just past mile marker 184, right where the road straightened out and the tree line dipped low on both sides. It looked like heat rising off pavement, except it hovered about a foot above the asphalt and stretched the width of my lane. A soft shimmer, almost glossy, like light bending wrong. I let off the gas without really thinking. The highway was empty. Nothing behind me, nothing ahead. Just dark field, low hills, and the faint line of the road vanishing into the distance. My name's Brett Hollander, and I'd been driving back from a late shift at a packaging plant in northern Wyoming. It was just after midnight, dry air, cool but not cold, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring if you paid attention too long. The distortion didn't fade when the car rolled closer. It stayed right there, pulsing almost gently, like it had its own rhythm. I remember thinking it looked like a mirage, but it didn't make sense for one to be that close and that defined. It wasn't fog either. It didn't move with the breeze. It just hung there, waiting. I eased forward anyway. I didn't know why. I think some part of me expected it to vanish before I hit it. It didn't. The front of the car passed through and the air turned strange for a second. Not hot, not cold, just wrong. My skin felt heavy, like the pressure shifted slightly. There was a soft hum, low and steady, not coming from the engine or the road. Then I was through it. Everything looked normal again. The dashboard clock caught my eye immediately. It read 12:47 a.m. I knew it had just said 12:39, maybe 30 seconds earlier. I stared at it, then glanced at my phone on the seat. Same time, 8 minutes gone. I looked back at the road, heart knocking a little faster now. The shimmer was gone. Everything behind me looked normal too. Empty. Dark. Still. Okay, I muttered, even though no one was there. That's not right. I kept driving, gripping the steering wheel harder than I realized. A mile passed, then another. The road started curving toward a low stretch of forest. That's when the radio flickered. No warning. Just static, sharp and hollow. Then it settled into something like a low drone. Not music, not words. Just a tone that wavered slightly, rising and falling like breath. I turned the volume knob down. It didn't change. The sound stayed at the same level. I hit the power button. The screen went dark. The tone continued. My throat went dry. I tapped the dashboard like the system just needed a reset. Still there. Outside, the rest of the world seemed to dim slightly, like the road ahead wasn't as clear as it should have been. My headlights worked fine, but everything beyond their reach felt muted, flat, like it wasn't fully there. The hum lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then it cut out all at once, snapping back into normal silence so abruptly it made my ears feel wrong. The radio powered back on by itself, tuned to the same country station I'd been listening to all night. The song picked up mid-chorus, like nothing had happened. I checked the clock again. 12:52. Another 5 minutes. Gone. I started talking out loud, more to keep myself grounded than anything else. You're tired, man. That's all. Long shift. Weird patch of road. Just keep going. I rolled down the window a little, letting cool air hit my face. It smelled faintly metallic, like old pennies, but it faded after a few seconds and went back to normal dry night smell. The highway dipped lower for a stretch. My headlights skimmed over cracked pavement and faded paint lines. I scanned every inch of the road ahead. That's when something caught my side mirror. A faint, pale glow. Not headlights. Too soft. It didn't move the way another car's lights would. It just lingered, a steady off-white dot. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. Back to the side mirror. Still there. I slowed slightly, watching it. It kept pace, but didn't grow brighter, didn't fall back. Just hovered at the same relative distance, like it knew where I was. My stomach tightened. I sped up. 80. Still there. Slowed back to 60. Still there. Then, without warning, the glow stretched slightly and faded, dissolving into nothing like breath on glass. The rest of the drive home dragged. I jumped at every dip in the road, every shadow pushing in from the shoulder. I checked the clock constantly. It behaved normally for the rest of the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was moving wrong around me. When I finally turned onto my gravel drive, I exhaled in frustration and relief. The house lights were off as usual. Quiet, dark, safe. I stepped out of the car and the night felt normal again. Cool. Still. Insects chirping somewhere in the grass. But even standing there, keys still in my hand, I kept thinking about the shimmer. How solid it looked. How deliberate. Inside, I locked the door and flipped on the living room lamp. The ordinary glow made everything feel steadier. I dropped my keys on the table and glanced at the microwave clock. 12:59 a.m. I'd left work just after 12:20. It didn't add up. I sat on the couch for a minute, listening to the quiet hum of the fridge and the ticking wall clock. I kept expecting something else to happen. Another sound, another flicker. Nothing did. Eventually I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that ripple hanging in the road like it had been waiting for me. The next morning on the way back to town, the stretch of highway looked completely ordinary. No shimmer, no distortion, just cracked pavement and faded lines like always. But when I reached mile marker 184, I found myself slowing down without meaning to, staring at the exact spot where I'd driven through whatever it was. The road stayed empty, and for just a second, the air there looked almost thinner. The lights flickered once, sharp and quick, then never came back to their full brightness. The living room settled into this dull half-glow, like someone had turned down a dimmer I didn't own. I stood there with a glass of water in my hand, waiting for it to correct itself, but it didn't. That's when I noticed the red glow outside. It hung low over my neighbor's roof, faint but steady, like a reflux of light, barely strong enough to color the shingles. It wasn't flashing or moving around, just there, suspended, quiet. It didn't light up the house or the yard below it. Only the air around the spot seemed tinted, like smoke catching sunset, even though it was already close to midnight. My name's Marisol Vega, and I lived on Mosswood Drive in a basic little ranch house sandwiched between identical ones. Normal street. Normal town. North side of Albuquerque, quiet even on weekends. That night was warm with a dry breeze rolling off the desert. the kind that rattled window screens and carried the faint smell of dust and sage. I set the glass down slow and stepped closer to the front window. The glow stayed fixed right over old Mr. Doherty's roof. I didn't see him outside. I didn't see any cars or movement, just the soft red spot hanging there, like it was studying the house. My phone was in my hand before I realized it. I checked the time, 11:54 p.m. I texted my sister Daniela without really explaining it. Are your lights weird or is it just me? No reply. The air inside felt heavier than normal. Not hot, just thick, like humidity without the damp. I glanced back at the hallway light and noticed it hummed faintly now, something I'd never heard before. Outside, the red glow pulsed once, almost like a heartbeat. It made my stomach tighten. I cracked the front door open. The night air slid in, dry and slightly cooler. The glow was more defined from this angle, hovering maybe 6 feet above the Doherty's roof line. No sound, no source, no reflection. Hello? I called, mostly out of instinct. My voice felt thin in the open air. Nothing answered. No doors opened, no movement. The glow shifted slightly, not drifting, more like repositioning itself. It dimmed for half a second, then grew faintly brighter again. The clouds overhead barely moved, slow and heavy, but the glow didn't follow them. It held its own space. Something about that felt wrong, like it wasn't part of the sky. I stepped onto the porch, wooden boards creaking under my feet. The porch light above me stayed dim, casting weak shadows around the railing. I noticed the bugs were unusually quiet. No buzzing, no chirping. I took 2 cautious steps forward. The red glow softened, then started thinning, stretching upward like mist being pulled apart. It didn't rise fast. It dissolved slowly, fading into the clouds until nothing remained but normal darkness. My chest stayed tight long after it disappeared. I stayed outside for a minute, scanning the roof, the street, the cloudy sky. Everything looked normal now. Too normal. When I went back inside, I flipped the light switches on and off, hoping maybe they'd kick back into full strength. They didn't. Everything remained slightly dim, like the entire electrical system had decided to behave differently. I sat on the couch and tried to settle my breathing. The house felt too quiet. The faint hum in the hallway light hadn't stopped. My phone buzzed. Daniela. What's weird? She asked. I stared at the message for a second, trying to figure out how to put what I'd just seen that didn't sound insane. Thought I saw something over Mr. Doherty's house, I typed. Red light. Probably nothing, she replied with a shrug emoji and nothing more. A few minutes passed. Then I heard a soft, rhythmic clicking coming from somewhere outside, like 2 small stones tapping together slowly. I froze, listening. It repeated again, steady, unbothered. I moved carefully toward the back window and peeked through the blinds. The yard was empty. The patio furniture sat where it always had. The old mesquite tree leaned slightly in the breeze. No one there. The clicking continued for another minute, then faded out like someone had walked away. I checked the clock on the stove. 12:06 a.m. It felt later than that. I didn't remember the last few minutes clearly, which made me uneasy. Had I spaced out? Had I just been sitting there too long? The light dimness hadn't corrected itself. Every room looked slightly off, like the house was running on weaker power than usual. I tried to ignore it, tried to move through the usual routine. Dishes, locking the door, double-checking windows, but every small sound made my shoulders tense. When I finally went to bed, the glow seemed gone from the street. No red, no humming, just quiet. I slept poorly. Sometime close to morning, I woke up with the sense that something had changed. The room looked faintly gray, dawn creeping in around the edges of the curtains. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain hitting hot wire, even though it hadn't rained. I checked my phone, 6:41 a.m. Outside, the neighbor's roof looked perfectly normal. No burn marks, no discoloration, nothing out of place. But when I flipped the bedroom light on, it was still dimmer than it should have been. All day, I felt like someone had tapped the world slightly out of alignment. Time moved weird. Sounds seemed muted. No one else seemed bothered. That night, just before sunset, I noticed a thin red tint reflecting faintly on the clouds far down the street. Not bright, barely there. It didn't last long, but kept the curtains half closed anyway. The forest went quiet all at once, like someone had stuffed invisible padding around everything. My boots still crunched faintly on gravel and pine needles. But the birds stopped mid-noise and the wind dropped off, so suddenly I thought my ears had glitched. I slowed down and looked around. This was supposed to be an easy trail, a loop outside of Hood River called Timberline Path. I'd done it plenty of times. It was late afternoon, sky a dull gray blanket like it might rain but hadn't committed yet. Cool air, damp ground, that kind of soft chill that sticks to your clothes. My name's Darren Holcomb, 33, bad knees, software tester, not the type who wanders deep into wilderness, but this trail always felt safe, maintained, marked, familiar. Except this part didn't feel right. The trees here looked the same, Douglas firs, dark bark, moss creeping up their sides, but the air was wrong, heavy, muted. My breathing sounded louder than it should have. I could hear my own pulse faintly like it had room to echo. I stepped forward again and realized even the distant highway noise was gone. No cars, no plane overhead, no insect buzz, just blank silence pressing in around me. That's when I noticed the light. Between two branches, maybe 30 feet ahead, a bright white sphere hovered in midair, about the size of a volleyball. Not blinding, just solid, soft edges. It didn't cast shadows. It didn't glow onto the leaves around it. It just existed there, perfectly still. No hum, no heat, no movement. My first thought was someone's drone, but there were no propellers, no body, no anything. Just that smooth ball of light suspended like it had forgotten gravity. I stopped walking without realizing it. The forest stayed muffled, like someone had turned the world's volume dial down to 0. "Hello?" I said lightly, more reflex than bravery. My voice sounded swallowed, dull, like it only traveled a few inches before dissolving. The sphere didn't react. I shifted my weight, my knee popped slightly, and that sound felt wrong, too loud compared to everything else. I glanced behind me, expecting maybe other hikers, but the trail lay empty, stretching back through quiet trees. I looked forward again. The sphere didn't move, didn't flicker, just hung there. I took one careful step toward it. Still nothing. A weird pressure sat behind my ears, like being underwater without the water. I swallowed and realized my mouth felt dry even though the air was damp. I checked my phone. No service. Not unusual out here, but still grounding to see something familiar. The time read 4:12 p.m. I looked up again. The sphere hadn't changed position. Another step, then another. The silence got thicker the closer I went, if that even made sense. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I was maybe 10 feet away, I noticed the air around the sphere looked slightly warped, like heat rising off pavement, except there was no shimmer or distortion flicker. Just a smooth bending of space, subtle but unmistakable. I didn't touch it. I don't know why, but I knew not to. A strange clicking noise began somewhere above the treetops, faint and rhythmic, like knuckles tapping wood slowly. It didn't feel mechanical, it didn't feel natural either. Just there. I tilted my head up, trying to locate it, but the branches swallowed everything above. When I looked back at the sphere, it pulsed once. Soft, slow, like a heartbeat. My chest tightened. "Okay," I muttered. "Nope." I stepped back. The air pressure didn't change. The glow remained steady. The silence pressed on. I stepped back again. The clicking above stopped. A chill crept up my arms, not from temperature, but instinct. My brain finally caught up and told me this wasn't right, this wasn't normal, and I shouldn't be standing here. So I turned around and walked. At first slowly, trying not to panic, then faster, then borderline jogging. The silence gradually loosened as I moved, sound bleeding back into place little by little. A rustle of leaves, a bird call, the faint sigh of wind through branches. My breathing returned to normal volume. I stopped after maybe 2 minutes and looked back. The trail behind me looked ordinary. The space where the sphere had been was empty. No light, no shimmer, just trees and shadow and dirt. My watch said 4:38 p.m. That didn't make sense. I hadn't walked that long. I checked my phone. Same time. A thin layer of sweat covered my back and palms, even though I hadn't exerted that much. "Get it together," I said quietly. But something still felt off. As I continued toward the trailhead, I kept noticing little things that didn't line up. The crunch of my steps didn't always match my movement. A branch swayed when there was no wind. Once, I swore I saw movement between trees that didn't belong to any animal, just the kind of shifting that makes your eyes strain. 10 minutes later, the sky started spitting light mist, cooling the air further. I zipped my jacket, but the damp smell felt sharper, more metallic somehow. When the parking lot finally came into view, I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My car sat where I'd left it. Everything normal. Everything familiar. I unlocked the door and dropped into the driver's seat, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel for a moment. That's when I noticed something else. A faint white glow reflected in the side mirror. I turned my head. Nothing there, just trees and foggy air. I looked back at the mirror. Still nothing. I started the engine anyway, heartbeat still uneven, and pulled out onto the gravel road. As I drove down the main strip leading to the highway, the forest gradually returned to the soft, layered normal it always had before. But every few minutes, I felt like I was being watched. Not followed, not chased, just observed. When I got home, the clock on my microwave said 5:03 p.m. Yet my hiking tracker claimed I'd spent almost 3 hours on a loop that usually took 90 minutes. I sat on my couch and tried to replay everything logically. Maybe I zoned out, maybe stress, maybe dehydration, except I didn't have any memory gaps. Just that quiet space and that hovering light. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I stood on my porch for a while and stared at the tree line beyond my backyard. For a second, barely noticeable, I thought I saw a faint pale glow between the branches. Then my neighbor's dog barked, and it vanished. The light came down fast, like someone had fired a flare straight out of the clouds, and my first thought was that it was going to slam into the cornfield right beside the road. I eased off the gas, squinting through the windshield, waiting for the flash and the smoke. But instead of hitting the ground, it slowed, hung there for half a second, then started rising again, smooth and steady, like it had changed its mind. It wasn't bright white like a normal flare. It was softer, kind of off yellow, almost warm looking, no streak, no sparks, just a glowing point floating upward until it blended into the dark sky and disappeared. I kept driving, but my hands felt tight on the wheel. I checked the rear view, checked the road, checked the sky again. There was nothing else up there. No planes, no drones, no blinking lights, just stars. My name is Aaron Velasquez. I'd been driving home from my cousin Mateo's place, cutting through farmland west of Salina, Kansas. It was after 10 p.m., and the whole stretch was that long, straight two-lane with nothing but corn and soybeans on either side and the occasional silo poking up like a monument to boredom. The weather had been weird all day. Hot, sticky, and windless, even after sunset. The kind of night where the air felt thick in your throat and your shirt clung to you, no matter how still you stood. A mile or so down the road, I noticed a second light, much dimmer, hovering lower, closer to the fields. It wasn't falling or rising, just sitting there, like a star that had dropped too low. I slowed even more, barely creeping forward, half expecting it to zip off or fade. It didn't. It stayed in the same spot, just pulsing slightly, like a slow breath. I rolled my window down a bit. The air smelled strangely sharp, metallic, like rain was coming, even though the sky was clear. When I reached the stretch of road closest to where the light had been hovering, it blinked out. Not faded, just off, like someone hit a switch. I kept driving, trying to tell myself it was just some farmer's equipment, maybe a drone, maybe static reflecting off something, but there was nothing for miles in either direction and no sound to go with it. No hum, no engine, no crackle, just quiet. My phone had no signal in that area, so I didn't even bother trying to check for anything. Another 5 minutes passed and I started to relax a little, convincing myself the whole thing was just my eyes playing tricks on me. That was when the radio cut out. The song that had been playing faded into a wet hiss, then into total silence. Not even static, just nothing. Then, underneath the quiet, I heard a faint, high-pitched tone. Not loud, just enough to notice if I held my breath. I glanced at the dash, no warnings, no flickering lights, everything looked normal. The tone shifted slightly, like it was moving around the inside of the car, even though it clearly wasn't coming from the speakers. I rolled the window down farther and leaned my head out just a little. The fields were perfectly still. No insects chirping, no wind through the leaves, no distant tractors. It felt like the noise of the night had been turned down too low. That's when I saw the light again. This time it wasn't above the field. It was beside the road, about 100 yards ahead, hovering just above the edge of the crops. Same soft color, same pulsing, It didn't move when I approached. It didn't get brighter either. Just stayed there, waiting. My stomach dropped. I slowed almost to a stop, then eased forward another few feet. The light drifted backward in perfect sync, keeping the same distance from my car like it was pacing me. I glanced at the speedometer. 20 miles per hour. The light matched it. Perfectly. I sped up to 30. So did it. I tapped the brakes. It slowed. There was no shape to it, no source. Just a floating glow that behaved like it knew exactly what my car was doing. The faint tone grew a little stronger, almost vibrating through the steering wheel, but not enough to make anything visibly shake. I didn't want to get out. I didn't even want to stop. I just kept driving, eyes constantly shifting between the road and that light. After what felt like 10 minutes, a farmhouse appeared ahead on the right. Porch light on, pickup parked out front. The glow was still there, hovering outside my left window, gliding along like it belonged. When the headlights swept over the farmhouse driveway, the light hesitated. For just a second, it lagged behind, almost like it realized someone else was nearby. Then it drifted sideways, away from the road, sliding back over the field where the crops swallowed it up. The tone faded with it until the night felt normal again. I didn't slow until I was almost home. My driveway gravel crunched underneath the tires, and that familiar sound felt way to the silence of the road. I just sat there for a minute, trying to steady my breathing. Nothing followed me. No lights, no strange noises. Inside, everything looked normal. My dog Luna lifted her head from the couch and wagged her tail, then settled back down like nothing had ever happened. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that soft glow hovering just beyond the trees behind my house. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. A faint scraping sound, like dry leaves being pushed slowly across gravel. Luna lifted her head and stared toward the back door, ears stiff. I looked through the kitchen window. The yard was empty. The moon barely lit the grass. No movement. But just for a moment, I caught the faintest reflection, pale and round, drifting at the edge of the property line behind the fence. It hovered there, barely visible, then rose gently until it vanished above the tree line. The night went quiet again. I didn't try to chase it. I didn't try to photograph it. There didn't even feel like there was a point. By morning, there was no trace of anything. No burned crops, no marks in the dirt. No sign that anything unusual had ever been near my property. I drove that same road again a few days later, mid-afternoon this time, bright sun and clear sky. Nothing appeared. But every time I passed the exact spot where that light had floated beside my car, the radio gave a soft crackle, and the dash clock blinked once like it was confused about the time. I never saw the flare again. But on nights when the air felt too still and the fields went silent all at once, I kept my curtains closed and my porch light on, and I avoided that back road entirely. The blinds jolted outward with a soft plastic crack, like someone had pressed their face hard against the glass and let go. I sat straight up in bed, heart already going way too fast for a Tuesday morning. It was still dark enough that the room looked gray-blue instead of black. I checked the clock on my nightstand. 5:17 a.m. The blinds were tilted outward, bowing away from the window, even though I always closed them flat. The thin string on the side hung loose and slightly twisted as if it had been tugged. I got up slow, bare feet hitting the cold floor, and stepped closer. The window itself was shut and locked. No cracks, no condensation. Just the blinds pressed outward like something had leaned into them from outside. Then I noticed the glow. The sky beyond the slats looked pale and washed like early sunrise, except the sun didn't come up this early in November. The glow wasn't orange or pink, just flat white, almost colorless. It faded right in front of me over a few seconds, draining out of the sky until everything returned to its usual dull, pre-dawn darkness. I stood there for a minute, listening. Nothing. No cars, no birds, no dogs barking, just the quiet hum of my refrigerator from somewhere down the hall. My name's Nolan Pierce. I lived alone in a one-story house on the edge of a half-finished subdivision outside Loveland, Colorado. The kind of neighborhood with empty lots and weeds where more houses were supposed to go, but never did. I pulled the blinds back carefully and looked outside. The yard looked normal. Patchy grass, frost settling on the ground, my mailbox tilted to the left like always. Beyond that, the empty field stretched out toward the tree line and the distant highway. Nothing moved. I checked the window frame to see if someone had tried to push it in. No smudges, no marks, no sign there had ever been anyone there at all. Still, the blinds stayed bent outward, like fingers had pressed them. I pushed them flat again. They creaked softly and returned to shape. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had stood there, right on the other side of the glass, close enough to fog it if it wanted to. I tried convincing myself it was just wind, but the air outside looked dead still. No branches swaying, no leaves shifting. On my way to work, I noticed more little things that didn't feel right. My porch light had burned out overnight, even though I'd replaced the bulb a week ago. The metal railing felt warmer than it should have been. And when I stepped off the porch, the gravel crunched louder than usual, like the air was thinner. I drove into town, trying not to think about it, but the memory of that pale glow stuck in my head like a half-remembered dream. Around lunchtime, my coworker Tessa asked if I looked tired. Didn't sleep great, I said, and left it at that. Hard to explain window blinds being pushed from the outside at 5 in the morning without sounding like I needed help. It was already getting dark by the time I pulled back into my driveway later that evening. The temperature had dropped and a thin fog rolled in from the fields, hugging the ground low and slow. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, staring at the front of my house. Every window looked fine, all blinds in place. I let myself breathe again. Inside, everything was exactly how I'd left it. I made a frozen dinner, scrolled my phone, and tried to pretend the morning had never happened. But around 9:40 p.m., the power flickered once. Just a soft blink, not enough to reset anything, but enough to notice. Then the porch light outside buzzed and dimmed before returning to normal. I got up and checked the front window. The fog had thickened, dulling everything into pale shapes. The streetlight across the road looked like a soft smear. The empty lot beside my house had disappeared into gray nothing. And parked at the very edge of the fog, far too close to my yard, was a faint outline of light that didn't belong to any car. Not headlights, not a flashlight, just a soft, loose glow suspended about waist height off the ground. I couldn't make out its shape, only that it wasn't touching anything. I opened the front door just slightly, cool air seeping in. The glow shifted. It didn't dart or move fast. It just drifted a few feet sideways, smooth as breath, as if it noticed the door opening. I felt my stomach tighten. "Hey," I called, instantly regretting it, no response. The glow pulsed once, barely brighter, then dulled again. The neighborhood stayed silent. I closed the door and locked it, stepping back as if that thin wood might somehow protect me from whatever that was. Through the window, the glow continued to hover motionless for several minutes, then slowly began to lift. Straight up, no arc, no fade, just rising into the fog. By the time it disappeared, there wasn't even a flicker left behind. I stood there a long time, waiting to feel a sense of relief that never really came. My chest stayed tight, and I kept expecting something to happen next. Nothing did. I ended up sleeping on the couch with the living room light on. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint tapping sound, soft, irregular, like nails brushing glass too lightly to scratch. I didn't open my eyes at first, stayed perfectly still, listening. The tapping moved slightly, then stopped. When I finally looked toward the window, all I saw was darkness and fog glowing faintly from the streetlight beyond. No shapes, no movement. The next morning, I checked every window. The one in my bedroom, the one whose blinds had bowed outward, had a faint vertical crease in the plastic slats, like pressure had been applied in a specific spot, harder than would happen by accident. I pressed my fingers there. The plastic bent easily, too easily. That same morning, my neighbor across the street, Roland, waved as I brought the trash bin out. "Everything all right last night?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I lied. "Why?" He glanced past me toward the field, then shrugged. "Saw a weird glow hanging over the lots. Thought teenagers or something." He said it like he didn't care much, like it wasn't worth digging into. But his eyes stayed distant a little longer than they should have. I watched him walk back inside, then looked out over the empty grass where the fog still lingered. No glow, no sign, just quiet. The The sound started while I was sitting on a flat rock with my shoes off, toes in the cold edge of the lake, just trying to relax after a long week. It was past 10, maybe closer to 11, and the whole shoreline was quiet, except for insects and the occasional splash from something farther out. There wasn't a breeze. The water looked like dark glass. Then I heard this soft mechanical noise above me. Not loud, not sudden, just a steady, low whirring, like something spinning slowly in the air. At first I figured it was a drone from someone's cabin across the water, but it didn't move like one. I tilted my head back and looked up. The stars above the lake were bright and clear, but right over the middle section, a perfectly round patch of darkness drifted across them. It wasn't a cloud. The edges were too clean. It was like someone had cut out a piece of the sky and slid something solid in front of it. The shadow moved slowly, steady, no wobble, no flicker, and the sound lined up with it perfectly. My name is Jonah Kellerman. I'd driven out to Lake Dorian that night because it was usually empty and calm. Just an old access road, a small dock, and a few dusty benches. I'd been here dozens of times before, never saw anything strange. It was always boring in the best way. I stood up slowly, gravel crunching under my heel, and kept my eyes on that strange round break in the stars. The mechanical sound stayed the same tone, like a distant motor running at the same speed. It didn't cast any light, just the faint absence of stars where it passed. I walked a few steps closer to the water, trying to see if I could make out anything reflective or shiny, but the surface stayed dark and calm. Hello? I didn't know why I said it, but the words slipped out anyway. No answer, just the soft whirring. The shape continued drifting overhead, crossing from left to right at a pace that felt way too controlled to be random. I watched it until it slipped behind the dark outline of the pine trees on the opposite shore and completely vanished. The sound faded a few seconds later, gradually, not suddenly. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. I stood there for a long while, scanning the sky like an idiot, waiting for it to come back. Nothing did. Just normal stars, normal night. I told myself it was probably some weird reflection or a trick of the clouds, even though that made no sense. After another minute, I forced myself to sit back down and try to shake it off. But the calm felt fake now. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I started hearing small sounds behind me on the tree line, not footsteps, more like something brushing through tall grass or low branches. I turned a couple times but didn't see anyone. The air felt heavier, still no wind. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this far out, but the battery had somehow dropped from 70% to 40 since I'd gotten there. I didn't remember using it much. The mechanical sound came back. Softer this time, higher pitch, almost delicate. I looked up again, heart already racing, and saw the same perfect round shadow sliding slowly across the stars, but this time it was lower, closer to the treetops. The shape didn't change at all. No blinking lights, no visible structure, just a moving absence. I found myself stepping backward without really thinking, gravel crunching louder now. The sound hummed steadily above me. It felt close, too close. A ripple spread across the lake directly below the shadow, even though the water everywhere else stayed smooth. The ripple formed a clean circle, expanding slowly outward as if something invisible hovered right above it. I whispered, "What is that?" The shadow paused, not stopped entirely, just slowed almost to nothing, hanging right there over the middle of the water. The whirring shifted slightly, the pitch adjusting by a tiny fraction, like something recalibrating. My skin prickled all over my arms. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The night smelled different suddenly, faintly metallic, like cold coins. Then the shadow resumed moving, sliding further across the sky. It passed over the far shore and faded into nothing again. No dramatic exit, just gone. I waited, breathing shallow, afraid if I moved too quickly it would come back sharper or louder. When nothing happened for a few minutes, I finally forced myself to move toward my car, parked near the dirt road entrance. As I walked away, the sound started again behind me. This time it didn't come from above, it came from somewhere behind the trees lining the parking area. A low, steady, mechanical hum, closer than before, too close to ignore. I stopped and turned slowly. The trees were dark outlines, no movement visible between them. But the humming became more distinct, like metal slowly sliding past metal. I didn't see any light, no shadow this time. Just that sound. My instincts screamed to leave, but my body hesitated, frozen in place for a second too long. I forced my legs forward and headed to my car, each step heavy and wrong. When I reached the driver's door, the hum cut out completely. Then the night dropped into absolute silence again, way too perfect. I got inside fast, locked the doors without thinking, and started the engine. The dashboard lights flickered once, dimming slightly, then returned to normal. As I pulled onto the narrow dirt road, my headlights swept across the tree line. For the briefest second, something circular seemed darker among the branches, like a hole in the night itself. Then I blinked, and it was gone. The rest of the drive home felt unreal. The radio wouldn't tune properly, only static, so I shut it off. The woods along the road looked thicker than usual, shadows stretching in awkward angles. When I reached my apartment, I didn't even bother turning on the porch light right away. I just stood there for a second, staring up at the sky. Everything looked normal, stars unchanged, no moving round void, no sound. Inside, I locked the door, double-checked it, and sat on my couch, listening to my own breathing until it finally settled. Later, around 2 in the morning, I checked my car dash cam, half expecting to see something unusual. There was nothing dramatic, just the dark road, my headlights, a normal drive. Except at one point near the lake, the image warped slightly for about 3 seconds, as if something passed close enough to distort the air. The audio picked up a faint rhythmic hum, barely noticeable unless I listened carefully. By morning, the lake looked normal again when I passed it on my way to work. Still water, still quiet. But when night came, I didn't go anywhere near it. I stayed inside, curtains half drawn, occasionally glancing at the sky through the window. Every now and then, if the night got too quiet, I almost thought I could hear that faint mechanical tone again, humming somewhere far above, drifting patiently across the dark. The alert chimed on my phone at 2:41 a.m., sharp enough to drag me halfway out of sleep. I hadn't set any alarms. I squinted at the screen and saw the usual notification from my security app. Movement detected. Front yard camera. I frowned and rolled onto my side, thumb already tapping the notification. The house was quiet. No dog barking, no footsteps outside, just the low hum of the fridge through the wall. The video loaded slow, buffering on my spotty Wi-Fi. When it finally played, all I saw was the front of my yard, dim and gray under the porch light, and then a sudden wash of pure white brightness that swallowed the whole frame for less than a second. The camera returned to normal right after. Empty yard, still bushes, no motion, no figure, no shadow, no car, just that light. My name is Maribel Torres. I lived alone in a small rental on the edge of Gallup, New Mexico, the kind of place with gravel instead of a lawn and more sky than street. I worked early mornings, so I usually slept pretty hard. My cameras didn't trigger often, and when they did, it was almost always a stray cat or the wind tossing the sagebrush around. This was different. I replayed the clip 3 times, watching the timestamp in the corner. 2:41 a.m. Nothing leading up to it. No gradual fade. Just light, like someone had taken a flash photo of my house from right up close, except there was no one there. I slipped out of bed and padded to the front window. I didn't pull the curtain aside right away. I just stood there, listening. No engines, no voices, no crunch of boots on gravel. I finally peered out and scanned the yard. Everything looked normal. Gate still closed. Old Volkswagen across the street parked the same way it always was. No lingering glow, no drifting light. I told myself it was a bug, maybe a glare glitch, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come back easy. Every faint noise outside made me tense. Around 3:10, the alert chimed again. Movement detected. My heart jumped so hard it hurt. I opened the app immediately. Again, the same thing. The yard, still and quiet, then a bright flare that washed over everything and vanished. Half a second. Gone. I checked the back camera. Nothing. Side yard. Nothing. Only the front. I pulled on a hoodie and padded down the hall, keeping the lights off as if that somehow made me safer. I opened the front door just a crack and peered out through the screen. The air smelled dry and dusty, like it always did at night out there. Not a single light moved beyond my porch. Then I noticed something else. The porch light looked dimmer than usual. It still worked, but the glow felt weak, like it had been drained slightly. I stepped out onto the wooden boards and looked up. The sky was clear. No clouds. No moon that night, just scattered stars and endless black above the desert. Nothing I could point at. Nothing that matched that blinding brightness from the footage. At 3:33, the phone signaled again. This time I was already awake, sitting on the couch with my knees pulled to my chest. I opened the clip and watched closely. Normal yard, gravel, fence, porch support beam, white blast. But this time, in between the brightness, I swore I saw a faint curve at the edge of the frame, as if something rounded had passed just beyond the camera's view. It didn't look solid, more like a distortion where the light bent strangely. My throat went dry. I checked the clock. 3:33 a.m. That's when my ceiling fan slowed for no reason, one long drag like the air had thickened, then returned to its normal speed. I tried calling my friend Elena just to hear another voice, but she didn't answer. I didn't leave a voicemail. I didn't want to sound ridiculous. The house felt tighter somehow, like the walls were pressing in just a little. At 4:02, the alert didn't come through, but my porch light flickered once. Not fully off, just a quick dip and back. I stood again by the front window, hands resting against the cold glass, and stared out into the dark. That's when the light came without any camera alert. A soft glow crept across the yard, starting near the fence line and washing slowly toward the house like a wave. Not as blinding as before, more muted, pale but steady. It didn't pulse, it didn't jitter, just slid quietly over the gravel. The shade of it made everything look colorless, drained. I held my breath, afraid to move, afraid that any sound might make it worse. As the glow reached the porch, my phone vibrated again. Movement detected. I glanced down at the screen and watched the live view this time instead of the recording. The camera struggled for half a second with the exposure, then showed only a white field where the yard should have been. No sound, no wind, no visible source. My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my ears. The light lingered longer than before. 2 seconds, 3. Then it thinned, pulling away like fog reverse flowing until my yard returned to normal. Dark, empty, silent. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came dry and hazy, pink light spilling over the horizon, and everything looked painfully normal. The gravel was undisturbed. My plants were fine. No strange marks on the wood, no burnt smell in the air. I checked all the recordings again over coffee. The clips existed, timestamps exact, each one the same, a brief flood of light that gave nothing away. I went to work like usual, but I kept glancing at my phone, expecting another alert even in broad daylight. Nothing came. That evening around 8, my neighbor Luis knocked on my door. He lived 2 houses down and kept chickens, always relaxed, always barefoot. "Did you mess with your porch light last night?" he asked casually. I stared at him. "What?" "It kept getting weird," he said. "Kept going dim and bright. Thought maybe you had one of those motion things installed." I shook my head slowly. "No," he shrugged, not pressing it. "Probably the wiring." He walked off, waved lazy like it was nothing at all. The next night stayed quiet. No alerts, no flickers, no unexplained glow. But when I scrolled through my camera history before bed, I noticed something new. At 2:41 a.m., between frames of darkness before the first light burst, there was a shape barely visible at the edge of the yard. Just a faint blur against the fence, like something tall had been standing there too close to the camera to focus. It didn't appear in the wide brightness, only in the moment, right before. I stared at the still frame until my eyes ached. Nothing else ever happened after that. No more alerts, no more flashes. But I started sleeping with my curtains closed and my phone face down on the nightstand. And sometimes when the house settled into quiet, I caught myself staring at the front door, feeling like the yard was watching me back. The phone flashlight was already on when I opened my eyes, pointed straight up at the ceiling like someone had set it that way on purpose. The beam sprayed a pale circle across the plaster, and right in the middle of it was a darker round patch, just faint enough that I might not have noticed it if the light wasn't aimed there. I lay still for a second, trying to figure out when I'd turned it on. I always plugged my phone in on the nightstand, screen face down. I never used the flashlight in bed. My first thought was I'd rolled over on it in my sleep, but it wasn't lying flat. It stood propped against the edge of my alarm clock, angled neatly upward, too carefully positioned to be an accident. The room felt warmer than it should have. It was late fall in Duluth, the kind of chilly morning where the air always smelled faintly wet, even through closed windows. I'd left a cracked window open overnight without meaning to, and fog pressed heavily against the glass, blurring the alley lights below. The circular mark on the ceiling looked like a faint shadow that didn't match anything else in the room. I sat up slowly and reached out to grab the phone. It was warm. Not hot, but warmer than a phone should feel after sitting unused for hours. When I turned off the flashlight, the mark was still visible. A perfect, soft circle about the size of a dinner plate. I touched it with my fingertips, expecting dust or peel or something obvious. The spot felt slightly warm under my skin. I pulled my hand back and frowned up at it, pressing again just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. The rest of the ceiling felt cold and rough. Only that one spot held any trace of heat. "Okay," I muttered quietly, my voice dry. I looked around the room. Nothing else seemed out of place. My jeans still sat slung over the chair. My boots were by the door. The tiny digital clock on the stove across the room read 5:38 a.m. I was alone. I lived alone. No one else had a key except my sister, and she lived 2 towns over and had a newborn. Showing up at my place before sunrise with no warning didn't make sense. I eased out of bed and walked over to the small stepladder I kept for storage shelves. The wood creaked under my bare feet. Climbing up, I held my palm close to the mark again. It was still warm. No scorch, no smell, no residue. Just heat, as if something round and hot had been held against it for a few seconds, then removed. I pressed my whole hand flat this time. The warmth sunk through my skin and made my fingers tingle slightly. A low vibration brushed the air, so subtle I almost missed it, like the hum of a distant appliance that wasn't actually running. I hopped down and unplugged my phone, watching for any odd notifications. No missed calls, no open apps. No sign that the flashlight had even been on longer than a few minutes. When I tried to remember falling asleep, the details felt smeared. I knew I'd been restless. I remembered scrolling through old photos of my coworker Morgan's dog. I remembered rolling onto my side. That was it. No memory of switching on the light. No memory of moving my phone. Outside, the fog pressed thicker against the window, dulling the street lamp below into a foggy halo. I stared out for a moment and noticed the glow reflected faintly on the glass, pulsing so lightly I couldn't be sure it was real. I pulled my gaze back to the ceiling just as the faint hum dipped again, barely audible. The warm circle began to fade, the heat softening until it matched the rest of the ceiling temperature. I dressed quickly, tugging on a sweater and heavy socks, still uneasy. When I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the tiny hallway, I noticed the air felt off, not cold, not warm, just strangely flat. My kitchen lights flicked once as I walked past them, even though I hadn't turned them on. "Great," I murmured, rubbing my face. I poured coffee, nerves tight and shaky in my chest, and carried the mug back toward the bedroom, keeping an eye on the ceiling mark. It was still there, faint as if someone had gently erased it. My phone vibrated suddenly, making me jump. No call. Just a motion alert from the cheap security cam I kept pointed at the alley window, mostly for peace of mind. I opened the footage. The clip showed a few seconds from just before 5:30 a.m. The view was washed in gray fog, the alley dumpsters sitting still. Then the screen flooded white for half a second, like a camera flash had gone off directly in front of it. And nothing else. No figure. No source. I replayed it twice, heart speeding up. The timestamp lined up with about 10 minutes before I'd woken up. I stepped back into the hallway and listened. No footsteps above me, no voices from the neighbors, just the hum of the building pipes and occasional clank from some distant unit. When I returned to the bedroom, the ceiling circle had cooled completely, but the faint discoloration remained, still perfectly round. I tried pressing a damp cloth to it, no change. I stood there, coffee going cold in my hand, staring up, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Steam from the mug curled toward the ceiling, drifting slightly sideways as that low vibration brushed through the air again. It lasted maybe 3 seconds this time. I slept with the lights on the next night without planning to. I didn't remember flipping the switch, but there it was, the bedroom illuminated when I woke up again, just before dawn. The ceiling mark hadn't returned. The phone sat flat on the nightstand like normal, but the memory of that warm, perfect circle never quite left. Neither did the way the air had felt in that moment, like the room had briefly belonged to something else. Every roadside reflector flared at the same time, suddenly so bright it hurt my eyes, like someone had cranked them all up with a dial. They lined the narrow two-lane road on either side, dot after dot glowing white instead of the usual dull amber. I eased off the gas instinctively, my foot hovering, trying to figure out what I was even looking at. I was driving through miles of open fields just outside Brenton Valley, that empty stretch where the corn ran right up to the gravel shoulder. It was late enough that the sky was going dusky orange, but not fully dark yet. The air still warm and dry, the kind of evening when the heat stayed trapped in the ground. Ahead of me, over the tops of the crops, a dull white light hovered low. Not headlights, not a flare. It sat just above the stalks, drifting slowly side to side like it was searching for something. My first thought was some farmer had a machine running out there, but nothing cast shadows or made noise. No engine, no rumble, just that soft, steady glow floating a few feet above the plants. I slowed down more, creeping forward, my hands tight on the wheel. The reflectors stayed intensely bright, like they were feeding off whatever that light was. My name is Elliot Mercer. I'd lived in this area most of my life. I knew what tractors looked like at dusk. I knew how dust caught headlights. This wasn't any of that. The light drifted closer to the road, just slightly, stopping and starting in tiny increments like it was testing the space ahead of it. It didn't illuminate the ground around it, which felt wrong. Light should spill. This one just existed. A faint buzzing sound filtered through my open window, low and steady. Not quite electrical, but not natural either. It made the hair on my arms stand up without me realizing it. I checked my mirrors. No other cars behind me, no oncoming headlights either. Just me and that field. The radio cut to static, not normal interference, just a blanket hiss, and then silence. The display still glowed, but no sound came through. I tapped it, but nothing changed. The white orb shifted again, slightly higher this time, hovering near the height of a pickup's roof. Slowly, it drifted forward along the edge of the corn, following the direction of the road like it knew exactly where I was heading. I muttered, "What the hell?" My voice sounded small in the car. The reflectors pulsed faintly, a subtle dim and bright cycle, like breathing. My dashboard lights flickered once, barely noticeable, but enough to make my stomach tighten. A sudden wave of quiet washed over everything. The usual sounds of bugs and distant wind faded, leaving this heavy hush that felt unnatural. Even the tires on the asphalt sounded muted. I watched the light glide closer to the road's edge, then stop completely, just hovering there like it was waiting. I didn't know why, but I pulled the car to the shoulder and stopped. The engine idled unevenly, a slight shudder passing through the steering wheel. The glowing shape held still. The dull white color reminded me of overcast daylight rather than anything electric. It felt soft, but solid at the same time. No defined edges, but clearly a sphere. Seconds stretched. I kept my eyes locked on it, barely blinking. Another strange thing. The air started to smell faintly metallic, like the inside of an old toolbox left in the sun. The buzzing sound deepened slightly, vibrating through the open window and rattling the side mirror just a touch. Then, as if noticing me, the light angled subtly toward the road and slid forward, crossing onto the asphalt about 50 feet ahead of my car, floating just above the surface. No shadows, no reflection, just presence. My chest tightened so hard it felt like I forgot to breathe for a second. I considered reversing, but the road behind me looked impossibly long and empty, washed in reflector glow. The light began drifting forward again, staying directly above the center of the lane, moving at a slow walking pace. It never bobbed, never wavered. I found myself following it, barely touching the gas, like I was being led somewhere without agreeing to it. Minutes passed like that. The endless fields on either side turned into dark silhouettes. I kept glancing at my clock, but it didn't seem to change normally. The digital numbers flickered once, then resumed like nothing had happened. At one point, the light swayed slightly and dipped toward the road, hovering lower than before, almost close enough that my headlights should have picked it up clearly. They didn't. My beams just slid past it. A thin ripple of air passed over my windshield like heat distortion, warping the view of the road momentarily as the sphere moved. The buzzing sound sharpened and my teeth vibrated faintly, like standing too close to heavy machinery. I blinked hard, then checked my mirrors again. Still nothing behind me. The light suddenly halted without warning, dead center of the road. I rolled to a stop, heart banging. The sphere moved backward, not turning or shifting, just gliding closer to my car in a straight line. 10 feet. 8. 5. I gripped the wheel so tight my fingers tingled. The light stopped 3 feet from the hood, close enough that I could see faint variations in its surface, like subtle waves under ice. The buzzing quieted until it was nearly silent. Everything felt suspended, heavy, expectant. Then, incredibly slowly, the light rose straight upward, maintaining its shape, climbing higher and higher until it reached treetop level. And then it drifted away from the road, back into the crops, resuming its slow, deliberate path, now heading deeper into the field. The reflectors dimmed back to normal. Sound crept back in. Crickets, wind, distant nightlife, like someone eased a volume knob. I didn't move for a long time. Finally, shaking, I turned the car around and headed back the way I came, eyes constantly scanning the fields. The radio came back on without explanation, playing a local station like nothing ever happened. When I reached my driveway, the porch light flicked on normally. No buzzing, no white glow, just quiet. Inside, I checked my phone. I'd been gone almost 20 minutes longer than I thought. No missed calls, no alerts. I stood by the window for a while, listening to the night outside, half expecting another flicker on the horizon. Nothing came. But even after the house settled and the usual sounds returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that light had been, it hadn't wandered there by accident. The row of lights first appeared while I was kicking my shoes off at the edge of Sandbridge Beach, the sand still holding on to the heat from the day. It was just past dusk, that awkward time when the sky wasn't fully dark yet, but the horizon had already swallowed the sun. The air smelled like salt and damp seaweed. It had been a warm day, but a cool breeze rolled in off the water and kept brushing across my arms. I hadn't planned on staying long. I'd only come down after dropping off my friend Maria at her apartment. She worked doubles most weekends and begged me to bring her leftover pasta, so I made the drive out to the coast after my shift at the hardware store. By the time I got back in my car, I just didn't feel like heading straight home. So I parked and walked out onto the beach with my phone in my pocket and my head still buzzing from the day. That was when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought they were buoys. Small, evenly spaced dots glowing faint amber, far out over the water. There were maybe 7 or 8 of them, lined up in a gentle curve, too symmetrical to feel natural, but not blinking like regular navigation markers. I stood there for a minute, hands shoved into my hoodie, watching. The water itself looked normal. A few little waves folded towards shore, leaving lines of foam that fizzled and slid back. The lights didn't move. They didn't rock with the water either. I walked closer to the shoreline so the wet sand soaked into my socks. The lights stayed the same distance out, hovering just above the surface, faint but clear. A couple passed further down the beach with a dog, and I glanced at them to see if they noticed. They kept moving, laughing, leash tugging, no reaction. "Okay," I murmured, mostly to myself. Another minute passed. Then one of the lights dipped slightly, almost like it had lost power. It sank slowly down until it slipped under the surface without rippling the water at all. No splash, no distortion, just gone. I felt my chest tighten a bit. Then the next light did the same thing. Slow descent, gone. One by one, the lights sank straight down like they were being lowered on invisible strings. Each time, the surface remained strangely calm. No waves, no foam, nothing to mark that anything had even passed through. By the time the 5th light disappeared, I was breathing shallow and slow, trying not to feel ridiculous standing there staring at the ocean like a statue. I checked my phone just to make sure it hadn't glitched my vision somehow. No messages. No alerts. Battery fine. When I looked back up, 2 lights remained. They sat there in the quiet, soft glow threading through the dark water. A gentle hum drifted through the air for just a second, almost like sound vibrating through a faraway structure underwater. Then those 2 dipped as well. Straight down. Silent. The ocean went dark again. I stayed frozen for a few more moments, trying to picture boats or underwater rigs or anything that made sense. My mind kept looping back to how evenly spaced they were, how precise the sinking looked. A cold shiver rolled down my neck, even though the night still felt warm. I took a cautious step back up the beach, then another. Something about the quiet didn't feel normal anymore. No distant engines, no gulls, just the soft hush of the tide. Behind me, the dunes stirred slightly as the breeze shifted. I turned my head slowly, expecting maybe someone standing there watching the same thing. No one. Just sandgrass swaying and the faint glow of parking lot lights 100 yards away. I glanced back at the water once more. Nothing. Just black waves folding in on themselves. I told myself it was probably fishing equipment or some weird reflection. I forced a small laugh, though it sounded shaky even to me. As I walked back up toward my car, my phone buzzed, making me flinch. A missed call from my coworker Trent. Timestamp said 3 minutes ago. I hadn't heard it ring. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors without thinking. The car interior felt too small, like the air inside had thickened. I glanced toward the ocean through the windshield, still nothing visible. When I turned the ignition, the radio crackled faint static before settling into silence. I never kept it on that station. I reached to change it and it snapped back to normal music. The drive home felt longer than usual, the dark coastline road curling through pockets of shadow. A couple times I thought I saw pale glimmers over the water out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked straight on, there was only darkness. Back at my apartment, I stood on the balcony for a while with the sea air still faint on my clothes. The horizon looked flat and empty, like nothing had ever been there. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I kept picturing those lights lowering into the water, like something deliberately retreating from sight. Not fleeing, just disappearing, one calm movement at a time. And every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that soft hum again, somewhere deep and distant, like it had been waiting for me to stop watching. The clouds first started looking wrong when I stepped out back for a smoke around 1:30 in the morning. It was one of those nights where the air felt too still, like everything had paused. I lived in a small rental outside of Ashford Falls, the kind of town that shut down completely after 10. My backyard wasn't much, just patchy grass, a half-broken fence, and a view of dark woods that went on forever. A single porch light buzzed above the door, throwing a dull yellow circle onto the ground. I leaned against the railing and lit up, trying to settle my nerves after a long shift at the hospital laundry room. My shoulders ached, and my hands still smelled faintly of detergent, no matter how much soap I used. That was when I noticed the clouds. They were thick, low, and gray, like they'd been sitting there all night. Except in the center of them, directly above the tree line, there was a perfectly smooth oval forming as if something invisible was pressing up from behind. At first I thought my eyes were just tired. I squinted, rubbed them with my free hand, and looked again. The shape remained. It wasn't ragged like normal clouds tearing apart. The edges were rounded and even, like someone had cut a hole out of the sky. A slow, pale glow appeared inside the opening. Not bright, just soft, almost milky white, like light bleeding through heavy fabric. The air shifted slightly. Not a breeze, more like pressure changing. I lowered the cigarette a little without realizing it. The glow stayed for maybe 3 seconds, long enough for my stomach to tighten and for the hairs on my arms to lift. Then the clouds closed back over the opening, smooth as if it had never been there. The light vanished completely. I stood frozen, lips half parted, listening for something. A plane, a helicopter, any sound at all. Nothing came. Just the distant croak of frogs down by the creek and the faint hum of power lines. I checked the sky again. Normal clouds, uneven, messy, drifting slowly. Wow, I muttered quietly. I finished the cigarette too fast and flicked the butt into the dirt. I told myself it was maybe heat rising or some weird reflection off the town water tower lights, but the way the opening formed didn't sit right with me. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake it off. Watched a few episodes of some mindless cooking show. The feeling never left though, like I'd stepped outside and briefly caught a glimpse of something I wasn't meant to. Around 2:15, my cat Margot started acting strange. She sat in the hallway, ears flat, staring toward the back door. Low, steady growl rumbling from her throat. She never did that, not even during thunderstorms. I walked over and crouched beside her. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't look at me, just stared at the door. A few seconds later, the faintest vibration passed through the floor. So light, I almost imagined it. The hanging picture frame near the kitchen shifted with a tiny tap against the wall. I swallowed hard. I told myself not to go back out, but curiosity kept building until it felt heavier than the fear. I grabbed my hoodie and stepped outside again. The yard looked the same. Quiet. Dark. Still. Then I looked up. High above the tree line, the clouds had opened again. Much wider this time. A smooth circular gap, almost too perfect, like a giant lens pointed straight down. Inside that opening, the glow had returned. Slightly brighter this time, still soft but more defined. It didn't cast shadows. The ground beneath wasn't lit up. It just hovered there, contained in the sky. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp and cold. I stepped forward without meaning to. Each footfall felt slower, heavier, shot like the ground resisted me. A low sound began to pulse through the air, more felt than heard. Not quite a hum, not quite vibration, something steady and deliberate. I held my breath. Behind the glow, there was a darker silhouette moving smoothly, just barely visible through the brightness. It didn't spin or flicker. It glided, slow and controlled, as if tracing the edge of the opening. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, just as suddenly, the glow dulled. The sound faded. The silhouette vanished. The clouds sealed shut again, leaving only an uneven gray mass drifting across the night sky. But the silence afterward felt wrong. Too complete. I didn't remember walking back inside, but I found myself locking the door with shaky hands, pulse still racing. I stood there for a long minute, one hand pressed against my chest. Margot crept behind me, tail low, still staring toward the back door. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound made me flinch. Every time the wind brushed the siding, I thought the clouds might open again. By morning, the sky looked completely normal. Wispy, pale blue, sun already rising over the trees, no sign of anything strange. But when I stepped outside to check the yard, there was a patch of grass directly beneath where the opening had been, yellowed, flattened in a perfect circle, cool to the touch despite the morning heat. And above it, the clouds moved on like nothing had ever parted at all. A faint humming crept through my open bedroom window and pulled me out of half sleep. It was just after 1 a.m., maybe 1:20, and the air felt sticky from the heat that had hung over the city all day. I lived on the third floor of an old brick apartment building near the river in East Camden, the kind of place where every sound carried weirdly. Sirens, traffic, people arguing 2 streets over. But this didn't sound like any of that. It was low and even, like someone holding a distant electric note. At first, I thought it was a transformer or some construction equipment running late, but it didn't fluctuate. It stayed perfectly steady. I rolled onto my side and stared at the blinds, watching the faint stripes of streetlight cut across my ceiling. The humming didn't fade. I sat up slowly and walked to the window. The building across the narrow alley was dark, except for one dim hallway light on the second floor. I pushed the blinds open just enough to peek through. There was a dull light floating in the air between the 2 buildings. Not attached, not reflecting, just hovering there, about the size of a bathroom sink, glowing softly like frosted glass. It hung maybe 10 feet out from my window, completely still, casting a pale wash over the brick and trash cans below. I froze with my fingers pinching the blinds. The humming was coming from it. I watched for a few seconds, trying to figure out if it was moving. It wasn't. No sway, no flicker, no visible source, just a quiet, steady presence. My first thought was a drone, but there was no shape, no outline of blades. My second thought was some weird light reflection from someone's window, but every other window was dark. I glanced down at the alley. Nothing else was happening. No one standing around, no shadows moving, just that light and the sound. Behind me, the pipes in my apartment ticked softly as they cooled. My phone lay face down on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it. For some reason, the idea of turning on a bright screen felt wrong, like it might change whatever was happening. I leaned closer to the glass, careful not to make a sound. That's when the light pulsed slightly. Once. Just a faint swell, like a breath. My chest tightened. "Hello?" I murmured, barely louder than a whisper. The light didn't react. The humming shifted, though. Still low, but it gained a gentle rhythm now, almost like something searching for a frequency. I stayed there for another minute, maybe two, afraid to blink. My reflection in the glass looked pale and tense. Behind the light, the brick of the opposite building looked almost warped, like heat shimmer. Then, down the hall outside my apartment, the floor creaked. Someone shifted in their unit. A door slammed softly. Normal sounds. Real life continuing. When I looked back to the window, the light had drifted 6 inches to the left. It moved so slowly I wasn't sure at first. I watched the gap between it and a cracked part of mortar in the wall. The distance kept changing. It was moving. Not toward me. Not away. Just sliding sideways, inch by inch, still perfectly level. My heart started beating faster, and I stepped back instinctively. The blinds clinked softly against the sill. The humming didn't change volume. It stayed calm, steady, patient. I checked the clock on my stove through the open doorway. 1:46 a.m. It felt like I'd been standing there forever. I sat on the edge of my bed and rubbed my face, half convinced this was some weird half-asleep hallucination. But the sound was still there. And when I stood up and looked again, the light was still hovering, now a little closer to the corner of the building. I noticed another detail then. The air around it looked thicker, almost like subtle fog, even though the night outside was clear. I watched as the light slowly dimmed, then brightened again, like a slow heartbeat. Each pulse came with the faintest change in the humming pattern. High, low, high again. My phone suddenly buzzed softly on the nightstand. A text from my friend Marisol, sent 10 minutes earlier. I hadn't heard it come through. "You awake? Hearing that weird buzzing too?" My stomach dropped. I typed back with shaky fingers. "You see anything outside?" A few seconds passed. "There's something out here. I'm scared to look at it." She lived 2 buildings down, same alley view. Before I could respond, the humming outside sharpened slightly. Not louder, just clearer, as if the air itself had tightened. I turned back to the window just in time to see the light lift upward about a foot, still slow and silent. The brick behind it stayed shadowless. It wasn't casting anything. It simply existed. Then, the strangest part happened. For a split second, the humming stopped completely. The silence was so sudden, it made the hairs on my arms lift. In that same instant, all the alley shadows deepened, like the light of the world dimmed just enough to notice. Then the humming returned. Lower now, and the glow thinned, stretched slightly, almost oval. I stepped backward again, heartbeat thudding painfully in my ears. "I don't like this," I muttered out loud. The light responded by drifting upward another few feet, now level with the edge of my window. I could see it clearer than before. It wasn't blinding. It was soft, almost matte, like diffused moonlight trapped inside itself. My reflection flickered across the glass. Then, in one smooth motion that shouldn't have been possible, it rose higher and higher, straight up out of the narrow alley gap and into the night sky. No trail, no shift in brightness. Just a clean vertical movement until it disappeared above the roofline. The humming faded as it climbed, thinning, until there was only the normal quiet of the city again. I stood there in complete stillness, staring at empty air where it had been floating seconds ago. Outside, the faint smell of hot pavement and river dampness moved through the open window. Far off, a car passed, music faint and distorted. The world settled back into boring reality like nothing had happened. My phone buzzed again. "It's gone," Marisol wrote. "Did you see that?" I didn't reply right away. I walked back to the bed, sat down slowly, and stared at my hands. They were trembling. The clock ticked to 2:05 a.m. After a while, I checked the alley one more time. Nothing there. No glow, no mist, just brick, dumpsters, and the faint outline of fire escapes. I crawled back into bed but didn't turn off the light. The silence felt wrong now, like it had weight. It took a long time before my breathing slowed. Even longer before I dared to look at the window again without expecting that low hum to return. The same star had been sitting in my windshield for so long that I finally realized it wasn't normal. I was driving home from a closing shift at the grocery store in Mays Ridge, cutting through the back roads that ran along the foothills. It was just after 4 a.m., that vague time before sunrise when everything felt drained and soft. A light mist hung over the pavement, and the air was cool enough that my breath fogged the glass when I exhaled too hard. I first noticed it about 10 minutes into the drive. One bright point of light, sharper than the others, sitting just above the dark outline of the mountains to my right. I assumed it was just a star, maybe Venus or something. I didn't know. I didn't care. I was tired and thinking about my bed. But as I kept driving, it stayed in the exact same spot, same angle, same height, same brightness. The road curved, trees thinned, a low valley opened up. The star didn't shift at all. It stayed locked in place like someone had pinned it to the sky. I glanced at the clock on my dash, 4:13 a.m. I looked back up again, still there. Another 5 minutes passed. The car heater rattled softly, pushing out slow bursts of warm air. My phone vibrated once on the console from a spam email I ignored. The star didn't move. That was when it started to bother me. I lowered the volume of the radio and rolled the window down an inch, letting cold, damp air creep inside. The smell of wet dirt and pine drifted in. Everything was quiet. No other cars, no animals crossing, just the hum of tires and that unmoving light. The logical part of my brain kicked in. Maybe it was a tower light or a distant plane flying toward me. But planes shifted slightly and tower lights blinked. This didn't blink, it just burned steady. I tested it by leaning left, then right, then slightly forward over the wheel. The light stayed perfectly centered in my view, as if it wasn't tied to the landscape at all. I swallowed and tried to laugh it off. "You're just tired, Caleb," I muttered to myself. Another stretch of road went by. A faded sign for Orchard Creek flashed through my headlights. I'd been watching this thing for at least 20 minutes now, and it hadn't drifted even an inch. Then something small happened that I couldn't explain. The light brightened slightly. Just a touch. Enough that the mist around it faintly shimmered. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The air inside the car felt heavier, like the pressure had changed without warning. My ears popped faintly, the way they did in elevators or when storms rolled in fast. I slowed down, foot easing off the gas. The light stayed steady. Watching. Waiting. Then, without any gradual movement, it slid sideways. Not drifting. Not fading. It just shifted left, smooth and immediate, like someone dragging a cursor across a screen. It moved about 15 feet in the sky, at least how it looked from where I sat, and then cut off completely. No fade, no trail, just gone. The spot where it had been turned empty and black again. I stared through the windshield, foot hovering just above the brake, heart pounding harder than it should have for something so quiet. I half expected another light to appear or some delayed sound to follow. But there was nothing, just the road and the faint hiss of my tires through damp gravel. My dash clock ticked to 4:37 a.m. I hadn't even noticed how much time had passed. A strange tightness crept into my chest, that uneasy feeling like I'd missed something important, like my attention had been pulled away for a moment I couldn't remember. I checked my mirrors. Behind me, the road was empty and black. I forced myself to keep driving, even though every instinct told me to pull over and stare at the spot where the light had been. The farther I went, the more wrong the silence felt. No frogs, no birds. The usual night sounds had gone completely absent. A few miles later, my phone screen lit up again without any notification sound. I glanced down for a split second and saw my location dot on the map app slightly off the road, somewhere between trees where I definitely hadn't driven. It corrected itself a moment later. When I reached the edge of town, the normal world slid back in like nothing had happened. Streetlights glowed. A stray dog trotted across a driveway. The distant buzz of an early delivery truck echoed down the street, but my shoulders never relaxed. When I got home and turned off the engine, the sudden silence felt just as heavy as the one on the road. I sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at my dark porch. I checked the time again, 5:02 a.m. I knew the drive shouldn't have taken that long. Even now, I couldn't say what that light was. I just knew it wasn't behaving like any star I'd ever seen. And I knew that for 20 quiet minutes, it had felt like something was looking directly back at me from very far away. The air started feeling wrong about 10 minutes into the trail, like I'd walked into a pocket of wet pressure that hadn't been there a second earlier. It was late dusk, that weird in-between where the sky still held some faded orange, but the woods were already going dark. I slowed down, mostly because my chest felt tight. like I just climbed a steep hill even though the ground was flat. This was the Elkwood Trail north of Crestline, a quiet stretch most people only used on weekends. I'd come out after work because I needed to clear my head. My name's Marin Caldwell, and I'd lived near these woods long enough to know how they usually felt. This wasn't it. I stopped and listened. No birds, no distant road noise. Even the leaves had gone still. I remember thinking it felt like the whole forest had paused, like when a fridge suddenly stops humming and the silence hits you all at once. I kept walking anyway. Then I saw it. Just above the tree line against the dimming sky, something wide and dark slid into view. Not fast, not slow either. It didn't look like any aircraft I'd ever seen. It was round, but not perfectly. More like a flattened disc, dark enough that it swallowed the last bit of light behind it. I thought it was a low cloud at first. But clouds don't move like that. It drifted sideways, smooth and deliberate, no rotation, no flicker, just steady. I stood there frozen, heart picking up speed slowly instead of all at once. I'd seen planes from this trail before, helicopters sometimes. This was silent, no engine, no wind, just that heavy air and this shape blocking part of the sky like it didn't belong there. A little voice in my head kept trying to logic it away. Drone, reflection, some weird optical trick. But even as I thought that, the air seemed to thicken more, pressing against my ears until everything felt slightly muted. The disc hovered for maybe 10 seconds, long enough for my hands to go damp and my mouth to dry out. I noticed the tops of the trees under it weren't swaying, even though a moment ago there'd been a slight breeze. Then it started drifting again, moving away from me, deeper into the woods. It faded behind the hill slope and just vanished. When it was gone, the birds didn't come back. The forest didn't relax, the quiet stayed. I looked down at my phone, mostly to check the time, but the screen felt oddly dim even at full brightness. 7:42 p.m., I swore it had been just after 7 when I'd seen the shape. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to get my breathing steady again. I finally forced myself to keep walking, but something felt off in a way I couldn't explain. The trail looked the same, dirt, packed hard, pine needles lining the edges, but I kept getting this sense of being watched. Not like eyes on me, more like awareness. Like something had registered I was there. A few minutes later, I heard a faint clicking sound above the canopy. Not mechanical exactly, but rhythmic, repeating every few seconds. I stopped again and tilted my head up, scanning for anything that could have made it. There was nothing. No birds, no visible shape, just that slow click, 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 and then sudden silence. I laughed once, nervous, mostly at myself. "Get it together," I muttered, even though no one could hear me. The trail curved ahead, and when I passed the bend, I realized the light had shifted more than it should have. The sky looked darker, almost like time had jumped forward. My phone now read 8:06. I hadn't been standing still that long. My stomach tightened again. I started walking faster, every sense sharpened. That heavy feeling in the air hadn't lifted, and the hairs on my arms stayed raised like something cold had brushed me, even though the evening was still warm. Halfway back toward the trailhead, I noticed a low humming sound, so faint I almost missed it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the ground itself was vibrating just beneath perception. I stopped and crouched, pressing my palm briefly against the dirt path. The faint vibration was real, subtle but there. "Okay," I whispered, more to hear a voice than anything else. A few seconds later, far behind me, between the trees, a pale glow flickered once. Just a quick pulse, soft and colorless like moonlight on fog. When I spun around, it was gone. I made the decision then to leave. Not run, not sprint. I didn't want to feel like prey, but I definitely picked up the pace. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle made my pulse jerk. More than once, I thought I saw movement through the branches that didn't line up with wind or shadow. Shapes that seemed just a little too smooth to be natural. By the time I reached the parking area, the sky had dimmed almost completely. The air pressure finally eased slightly, like whatever density had settled on the forest was loosening its grip. My car sat where I'd left it. Everything normal. Too normal. When I unlocked the door and got in, my phone vibrated with a missed call from my brother, Elias. The timestamp said 7:55. I checked the voicemail. "Hey, Mare, you good? You called me and didn't say anything, just some weird static and breathing noise. Call me back." I stared at the screen. I hadn't called him. I hadn't even touched my phone during the walk except to check the time. My call log showed an outgoing call to Elias at 7:54 that lasted 30 seconds. I sat there for a long moment, engine still off, the quiet of the woods pressing in on all sides. On the drive home, I kept scanning the sky through the windshield. Everything looked empty. Just fading clouds and the last trace of daylight dissolving behind the mountains. At home, I showered and tried to shake it off, but the pressure feeling lingered faintly in my temples, like I'd spent too long at a high altitude. I checked my trail app out of habit. It showed my GPS path cutting off for about 12 minutes, right around where I'd seen the disc. After that, the line resumed closer to the trailhead, like I'd been moved forward without walking the in-between. Just before bed, I stood by the window and looked out toward the dark tree lines in the distance. The sky was clear, stars faint but visible. I half expected to see that shape again, hovering quietly, waiting. There was nothing, just normal night. Still, the quiet didn't feel the same as it used to. It no longer felt empty. The pale silver light filled the bedroom so evenly that I thought morning had come early, even though my phone on the nightstand said 2:17 a.m. I blinked a few times, trying to focus, and sat up on instinct. The second I moved, the light vanished. The room snapped back to darkness, thick and quiet, and my eyes scrambled to adjust. My name's Eli Navarro, and I'd been living alone in a narrow split-level place on the edge of Galewood for about 6 months. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. Quiet streets, old maples, a few porch lights always left on. That night had been cold, the kind where frost crept up the edges of the windows, but nothing like snow or fog. I sat there for a minute, listening. No cars outside, no footsteps upstairs, just the faint hum of the heater starting and stopping. My heart was already faster than it should have been, but I told myself it was just a weird dream I'd half woken from. Still, the light had felt too real. I lay back down, pulled the blanket up, and tried to close my eyes again. It couldn't have been more than 2 minutes before a soft metallic scent drifted in, sharp and clean, like cold air mixing with pennies. I frowned and sat up again, sniffing the air like an idiot. The smell lingered, faint but definite. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and padded to the window. The blinds were still closed, but a thin glow seeped through the corners like something hovered just beyond them. It wasn't streetlight yellow or neighbor's porch light warm. It was silvery and cool, almost colorless. When I pulled the blinds open a few inches, the glow disappeared again, replaced by a normal dark yard and the faint outline of the back fence. No car, no flashlight, no motion. I stood there, staring into the black yard, trying to make sense of it. The air outside looked completely still. Even the branches that usually swayed a little in the breeze weren't moving. A slight tapping sound came from the siding near the kitchen window. Not rhythmic, just a gentle, slow click, like someone brushing a fingernail against metal. I moved closer to the glass, squinting out. Nothing. Then the tapping stopped. I stepped back and rubbed my face, suddenly aware of how quiet everything felt. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like sound had been turned down rather than fading naturally. I checked my phone again. 2:23 a.m., no notifications, no missed calls, but my sleep tracking app showed something odd. A spike of activity right around 2:15, like I'd been restless or moving before waking. I hadn't felt that part at all. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to shake the weird edge crawling under my skin. The faint metallic smell followed me. When I turned on the tap, it sputtered once and then ran normally. For some reason, the noise felt too loud for the space. As I leaned against the counter, the silver light returned. It bled through the small window above the sink, brightening the tiles in a cold, smooth wash. This time, I didn't move, just watched it spread like fog made of light. It didn't flicker. It didn't shift. It was steady. My pulse hammered slowly instead of racing, like my body hadn't yet caught up to what my brain knew was wrong. I whispered, "Hello?" to an empty apartment, not expecting an answer, but needing to break the silence. Above the cabinets, the light seemed to intensify for just a second, and then, again, it disappeared. The room dropped back into dim shadows, leaving me standing there with the echo of that word still hanging in the air. Outside, a low humming drifted through the walls, barely audible. It felt more like pressure than sound. The floorboards vibrated faintly under my bare feet. I stepped closer to the back door and rested my hand on the handle, more out of instinct than bravery. The knob felt colder than usual. I could still smell that metallic note in the air. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, listening, breathing shallow, as the vibration faded and the hum thinned out until it was gone. The stillness after that felt unreal. I checked the time again. 2:41 a.m. Somehow almost 20 minutes had passed, but it hadn't felt that long. Not even close. My shoulders ached faintly, the way they did after sleeping wrong or tensing too long. I glanced around the kitchen and noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the wall near the doorframe, a faint circular mark, lighter than the paint around it, like something had pressed warm against it briefly. It wasn't damp, it wasn't scorched, just slightly discolored and warmer than the surrounding wall when I touched it. My skin prickled. I grabbed my robe and my phone and walked through the living room toward the front window. If something had been outside, I wanted to see at least a trace of it. The street looked normal, empty. A single porch light, 2 houses down, cast a weak pool of yellow on the sidewalk. Everything else was dark. As I stood there, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, the distant hum returned once more, softer, like it was moving away. It slid through the air for maybe 5 seconds, then cut off sharply. Silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on my couch until first light, wrapped in the robe, scrolling aimlessly and glancing at the windows every few minutes. Nothing else happened. No lights, no sounds, no movement outside. By morning, it almost felt like I'd imagined the whole thing, except the faint circle on the kitchen wall was still there, and the air, even in daylight, carried the barest hint of that metallic smell beside the back door. I went about my day, took a shower, made coffee, tried to act normal, but every time a shadow shifted on the counter or light reflected oddly off the floor, my eyes snapped up automatically. That night, I left a lamp on by the bed. I didn't want to wake up to silver light again without some anchor that felt solid and real. When I finally did fall asleep, it was restless and shallow. And just before drifting off completely, I could have sworn I felt that same heavy pressure in the air, like something had returned to study the quiet from a distance. Jordan pulled his phone out while we were sitting on the tailgate and said, "Hey, this came out weird," like it was no big deal. We were parked at the overlook on Pine Ridge, the one above the quarry, where people went to smoke or stare at the city lights. It was late, but not crazy late, maybe a little after 11:30 p.m. The air felt dry and warm for how high we were, and the sky was clear enough to show a lot of stars. No wind, just that still quiet you get when everything finally cools off after a long day. He swung the phone around so I could see. It was a photo of the sky, taken maybe half an hour earlier. Most of it looked normal. Dark blue-black sky, scattered stars, faint glow from the town below. But near the center of the image was a pale blur, like someone had brushed a thumb across the lens. "Probably just dust," I said. "Or your night mode glitching again." Jordan zoomed in. "Yeah, but look at the bottom." I leaned closer. That's when I saw it. At the very bottom edge of the photo, right near the shadow of the trees lining the overlook, was a figure. A person standing alone, half-turned, face blurred by the same strange haze. It was me. Same jacket, same stance, same messy hair that stuck up no matter what I did, and I was standing right where we'd been sitting earlier that night. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. "That's not... What time did you take this?" Jordan's brow furrowed. "Like 11:15? I think. You walked over there for a minute, didn't you? I figured you were just taking a call or something." I shook my head automatically, even though my chest had started to feel tight. "No, I never got up." "You did," he said, still casual. "You went toward the railing, and I just snapped the sky while you were gone. I didn't even realize you'd be in it." "I don't remember that at all," I said. He looked at me more carefully then. "You okay?" I forced a half laugh. "Yeah. Probably just spaced out. It's been a long week." But when I glanced past him toward the dark edge of the overlook, something didn't feel right. The trees were just silhouettes. The gravel path glowed faintly under the moon. Nothing looked unusual. Still, I felt like I'd already been standing out there recently, even though I knew I hadn't. Jordan locked his phone and set it down between us. Want to head out soon? My service is trash up here anyway. Yeah, I said, though my eyes kept drifting back to where the photo said I'd been. We stayed a few more minutes, mostly quiet. That strange blur on his screen stuck in my head. I tried to replay the last hour in my mind, getting coffee, driving up the ridge, parking, sitting, talking about work. It all felt normal. No gaps, no fuzzy spots. But when we got back in the car, I noticed something else. My GPS timeline app showed I'd been at the overlook for longer than I thought. It said I'd arrived at 10:52, but I was sure we pulled in around 11:05. I mentioned it to Jordan, but he shrugged it off. Apps mess up all the time, he said. Don't overthink it. The drive back down was quiet, and I kept checking the side of the road, half expecting to see the same pale blur hovering somewhere among the trees. Every time the headlights caught mist or dust, my heart jumped. When we reached town, Jordan dropped me off outside my building. The streetlights buzzed weakly, casting dull orange halos on the cracked sidewalk. He waved and drove off, music fading as he turned the corner. I stood there alone for a second before going inside. The photo nagged at me, the way my figure looked wrong somehow, too still. Like I hadn't been moving at all. Up in my apartment, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no strange messages, just the normal clutter of notifications. I sent Jordan a text. Can you send me that pic? He replied a minute later. Yeah, weird one. The image loaded slowly. I zoomed in again, this time looking closer at the blur instead of my own silhouette. The haze wasn't random. It almost looked layered, like soft overlapping shapes, faint arcs of light too subtle to define. And the space around my figure in the photo, it seemed slightly brighter, like something unseen had been nearby. I stared at it until my eyes hurt. Around 1:10 a.m., my bedroom light flickered once. Not enough to go dark, just a quick dip, like the power hesitated. I frowned and sat up. The room felt warmer than a second ago, not stuffy, just oddly heated in patches. I walked over to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The street below looked normal, empty, quiet, but there was a faint glow further down the block, near the alley behind the convenience store. It was subtle, almost like a reflection, but I couldn't see a source. I watched it for a full minute. Then it faded. My phone buzzed in my hand. Jordan again. Dude, look closer at the photo. Something's off. I already am, I texted back. What do you see? Another pause. Zoom in behind you. There's something there, but it's not anything I recognized. I pinched the screen and zoomed until the grain blurred. Behind my figure, right above the railing, was a faint vertical shape. Taller than me. Slightly brighter around the edges. No clear features, just an unnaturally smooth outline that didn't match any part of the overlook. I swallowed hard and lowered the phone slowly. In my apartment, everything was quiet. No footsteps, no neighbors talking, just the distant hum of traffic somewhere far off. I checked the clock, 1:34 a.m. A soft vibration rippled through the floorboards, so light I might have imagined it if the lampshade hadn't rattled slightly. It lasted only a few seconds. Jordan, did you hear or feel anything just now? I typed. No, he replied. But my dog just started growling at nothing. A chill crept through me. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the same image of myself standing under the night sky, frozen in place with that smooth blur hovering close by. By morning, the neighborhood looked normal again. Birds, early joggers, sunlight bouncing off parked cars. The strange glow was gone, and the tension in the air felt thinner, like a heavy fog had finally moved on. Jordan called around 9 a.m. Hey, he said, voice quieter than usual. The photo looks different now. What do you mean? The blur faded, and you're not in it anymore. I pulled the image up on my own phone again. He was right. The sky looked ordinary. No haze, no figure, just stars and darkness like any other night photo. But the timestamp still read 11:15 p.m., and the strange feeling that I'd been somewhere I couldn't remember never really faded, no matter how hard I tried to pretend it was nothing. The glow slid along the top of the backyard fence while I was washing a mug at the kitchen sink. Faint but steady, like someone had a flashlight pointed sideways from the other yard. I paused with the sponge in my hand, water running over my knuckles, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was close to midnight. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the fridge and the pipes creaking the way they always did when the hot water ran too long. Outside, it was one of those heavy summer nights where the air felt thick even through the open window. No wind, no bugs, just still. The glow moved slowly, tracing the top edge of the fence, never dipping or rising. It didn't flicker like a normal light. It just traveled, smooth and deliberate. I leaned closer to the window. The backyard was dark except for that pale thread of brightness, barely strong enough to light the wood. It wasn't blue or yellow, just pale, almost colorless. My first thought was it was Gomez next door messing around again. He worked late and liked to tinker with weird yard lights and solar panels, but this didn't behave like anything he'd put up before. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on a towel, listening. No footsteps, no voices, no music, just quiet. The glow paused near the corner of the fence, sitting there like it had reached a point of interest. I stood there, staring, feeling stupid for not knowing what to make of it. Then it started drifting upward. It didn't climb like a flashlight beam or bounce like a reflection. It simply lifted, the top of it separating cleanly from the fence until it was hovering a few feet above the yard. My stomach tightened without any obvious reason. I stepped away from the sink and grabbed my hoodie from the back of a chair, slipping it on even though the kitchen felt warm. The air outside suddenly seemed colder just looking at it. I unlatched the back door and stepped onto the porch. The yard smelled damp, like the grass hadn't fully dried. The glow now hovered near the middle of the yard, 4 or 5 feet off the ground, drifting toward the center as if it had somewhere to be. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weak in the open air. No response. The light gave no sign of reacting. I walked down the porch steps, shoes crunching lightly against the gravel. Even the gravel sounded too loud in the quiet. The glow continued its slow path, crossing over the patch where my dog usually slept during the day. He wasn't there. He'd gone upstairs hours earlier and refused to come back down, which I hadn't thought much about at the time. As I followed it a few feet into the yard, I realized something else felt off. The usual background noise was gone. No distant traffic, no rustling leaves, no passing car headlights from the far road, just silence. Then a faint, low hum crept into the air, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. It wasn't loud enough to hear clearly, more like a vibration in the bones of my jaw. The glow reached the center of the yard and stopped. I stood there about 10 feet away, unsure of what I was doing. The light wasn't blinding. It wasn't warm. It just hovered, perfectly still, a soft oval shape that pulsed slightly like a slow breath. A shadow flickered once across the fence behind it, but nothing passed between us that I could see. I glanced up at the sky. Clouds hung low and dark, too thick to see any stars. The air above the light looked faintly distorted, like heat rising off pavement, even though the night was relatively cool. The humming deepened slightly, making the metal railing of the porch tremble just enough for me to notice. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out instinctively. No notifications, no missed calls, just the screen lighting up for no reason. The glow drifted again, rising slowly, higher than the fence now, lifting soundlessly into the air. I tilted my head back, tracking it. It made no noise as it climbed. It didn't wobble. It didn't change shape, just moved straight up like it was being reeled in by something invisible. The hum softened as it went higher. I took a few cautious steps forward, squinting, trying to get a better look. The edges of it began to blur slightly, fading as it neared the bottom of the cloud cover. And then it slipped into the clouds and disappeared entirely. No fade out, just gone. The hum vanished at the same moment. The yard went back to normal darkness. The crickets hesitantly resumed their noise a few moments later, like they were testing if it was safe. I stood there for a while longer, heartbeat loud in my ears, staring up at the blank sky. Nothing moved. Nothing returned. Eventually, I backed toward the porch, re-entered the house, and locked the door. I hovered by the window for a while, watching the fence, waiting for the glow to reappear. It didn't. When I checked my phone again, I noticed the time had somehow jumped ahead almost 15 minutes from when I'd first seen the glow, though it hadn't felt that long at all. I slept poorly that night. Every small sound made me sit up, half expecting the faint light to press against the blinds or slide across the wall. Morning came like nothing had happened. dew on the grass, fence unchanged, no sign of anything unusual. But every now and then, when I washed dishes late after that, I caught myself glancing over the fence, half waiting for that soft, pale line to drift across the wood again. I was out on the old service road behind Millen Park with my friend Jenna when it happened. The place wasn't really meant for stargazing. Half the benches were broken, and the trail lights hadn't worked in years. But the trees opened up enough that you could see a big stretch of sky without too much glare from town. We used to go out there during college when we wanted to talk without bumping into anyone we knew. After graduation, we both stayed in town, and the habit stuck. That night was cold and unusually clear for late September. The kind of cold that feels sharp at the edges, but not miserable. We brought a thermos of coffee and sat on the hood of Jenna's car, watching the sky and talking about nothing important. At some point, we started trying to name constellations, even though neither of us actually remembered more than the obvious ones. I remember looking straight up and feeling like the stars were brighter than usual. Not twinkly or romantic, just bright, steady points. The air was still, no breeze at all, and the night felt quiet in that strange way where you can hear your own breathing. Jenna was the one who noticed it first. She nudged my shoulder, not urgently, just enough to get me to look where she pointed. "Hey," she said, "that one's weird." It took me a second to figure out which star she meant. It wasn't the brightest or biggest, just a normal-looking point of light sitting a bit off to the left of Cassiopeia. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if she hadn't said anything. "What's weird about it?" I asked. "It's blinking." I watched it, expecting the usual twinkle, but the light wasn't flickering randomly. It was blinking in a pattern. 3 short flashes, a pause, then 1 longer flash, then exactly the same thing again, and again. "Plane," I said, even though it didn't look like any plane light I'd ever seen. "It's not moving," she said. She was right. It stayed fixed in place, perfectly still, blinking its little pattern like it was signaling something. I stared at it long enough that I started to feel this pressure in my chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Like I was paying attention to something I normally would have ignored. We listened for the sound of an aircraft. Nothing. No distant hum, no wind pushing through the trees, no animals. It felt like the whole park was holding its breath. A minute passed, maybe 2. The star kept blinking with the same rhythm. Then Jenna said, "Okay, that's actually freaking me out a little." The weird part was, I wasn't freaked out yet, just confused. My brain was still trying to find the normal explanation. Satellite? Maybe? Drone? Except drones don't just hover that high, and satellites don't blink like that. I pulled out my phone and trying to zoom in. The screen made the star look like a blurred white dot. Nothing helpful. I lowered the phone and looked back up. The blinking stopped. The light stayed on, steady, normal star bright, so I thought maybe it had just coincidentally changed. A dimming effect or something atmospheric. But then it moved. It moved so fast that at first I wasn't sure I'd actually seen motion. Just a shift, no trail, no fade, no jerkiness. 1 second it was next to Cassiopeia, the next it was farther to the right, crossing a big chunk of sky in a perfectly straight line. "Did you see that?" Jenna whispered. I could only nod. I felt something deep in my gut, the kind of feeling that hits before you understand it. Just this sudden certainty that the night wasn't normal anymore. The light kept going in that straight line, neither rising nor falling, not curving like a satellite. It didn't speed up or slow down. It just moved, steady and deliberate, like it had a destination that wasn't anywhere near us. After about 10 seconds, it stopped again, perfectly still. I counted silently in my head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 7 seconds. Then the blinking started again. 3 short flashes, pause, 1 long. Jenna slid off the hood of the car and stood next to me. "That's not a plane," she said. "That's not anything I know." The temperature felt like it had dropped. I don't know if it really did, or if I just suddenly became more aware of how still the air was. My breath was turning into a thick, white puff, more than it should have for the temperature we'd started with. The star blinked through its pattern 1 more time. Then it shot straight upward. Not angled, straight vertical, like someone pulling a string taut. It moved fast, faster than before. I tracked it until it was barely visible, then not at all. And that should have been the end of it. But the sky didn't go back to normal. Not right away. I noticed it first. A faint shimmer around the spot where the light had vanished. Not bright, just a distortion like heat rising off the hood of a car, except it was 30 degrees out. The distortion grew wider, spreading like the air was bending. The stars behind it wavered and rippled, sliding out of place for a second. Then everything snapped back. The sky was still again. Perfectly still. No shimmer, no blinking, no motion. I tried to say something, some joke about satellites or optical illusions, but the words caught in my throat. My chest felt tight, like my body knew something my mind didn't want to accept. Jenna got back onto the hood so slowly you'd think it was covered in ice. She didn't speak. She just stared at the place where the light had been. I finally said, "Let's just wait a minute. Maybe it'll come back." She didn't answer. She just took the thermos from beside her and drank without looking down. We sat there for what felt like a long time. My phone said it had been 7 minutes, but I'm not convinced that was right. It felt both shorter and longer in that strange way where your brain loses its grip on time. No more blinking, no more movement, just ordinary stars in an ordinary sky. Eventually Jenna said, "Let's go, please." Her voice didn't sound like her voice. Not scared exactly, quiet, like she was trying not to disturb something. We got in her car and drove back into town. Every streetlight felt too bright. Every shadow felt too dark. The whole ride home, I kept checking the sky through the windshield, waiting to see the blinking start again. Nothing did. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the moment when the star stopped blinking and began moving, smooth and silent, like it was gliding on rails. The next morning, Jenna texted me just 2 words: never again. We didn't go back to that spot after dark for months, and sometimes when the sky is perfectly clear and still, I'll look up and find that same place near Cassiopeia. Everything will look normal, but every once in a while I think I see a flicker, not random, just faint enough to wonder if it's starting again. I woke up because the air felt wrong. Not hot exactly, just too warm for how cold it had been when I went to bed. I sleep with the window cracked even in winter, so usually the room has that sharp, cold bite to it. But when I opened my eyes, the air felt thick and warm like a summer night. For a second, I thought maybe the heat had turned on, but the vent wasn't blowing. The house was silent. No hum from the fridge down the hall, no trucks passing, nothing. I sat up and immediately noticed the light. My room should have been completely dark. I live on a small street in Willow Creek, and the one street lamp near my house burned out months ago. But the whole room had this pale white wash over it, bright enough that I could see the texture in the paint on the wall. I pulled the blanket off and walked to the window. The street outside was glowing. Not like headlights, not like a security light or someone pointing a flashlight. It wasn't coming from any single direction. It was just there. A soft, uniform white glow that filled everything. The pavement, the parked cars, even the air between the houses. I checked the sky first because that seemed like the obvious thing to do. It was totally blank. Not cloudy, not clear. Just a flat, white nothing with no moon, no stars, no movement. I remember leaning closer to the glass like maybe there was frost distorting things, but the window was smooth and warm to the touch. Too warm. I looked up and down the street, expecting someone else to come outside, or at least a dog barking or something, but there was nobody. No silhouettes in windows, no sound of blinds shifting. The entire block looked frozen. The glow didn't flicker, didn't pulse. It just hung there, steady and silent. I opened the window to see if I could hear anything. Warm air rolled in immediately, warmer than my room. And the silence hit even harder. It wasn't the kind of quiet where you just don't hear cars or people. This was like the world had muted itself. No insects, no wind, no hums, no distant highway, no planes overhead. Nothing. Nothing. I whispered hello out of pure instinct. It sounded wrong. My voice came out flat, like it didn't echo off anything. The sound just fell away. I stuck my head out the window and looked toward the intersection. Still no movement. Just that impossible glow. I was about 5 seconds away from going outside to check when something shifted. It wasn't a sound, it was the light itself. Just for an instant, the glow dimmed and brightened again, not like a flicker, but like something passed between me and whatever was lighting everything. An interruption. I froze with my hands on the windowsill. About 20 yards down the street, something moved. At first, I thought it was a person stepping out from behind a car, but the shape was too soft around the edges, like my eyes couldn't quite focus on it. It was tall, but not by a lot, maybe a little taller than the average guy. The outline kept blurring, like a camera struggling to focus in low light, except the street was bright. The shape shifted slightly, leaning or turning. I couldn't tell, but every tiny movement it made sent a ripple through the glow. Very subtle, like dropping a pebble into water. My first stupid thought was that someone had set up some kind of weird light installation, like an art thing. But then the shape drifted, not walked, drifted. It moved sideways without bending its legs. I couldn't even see legs. It just slid. I ducked back immediately, heart pounding like I was a kid hiding from a stranger. I pressed my back to the wall beside the window and tried to breathe quietly. The glow pulsed again. Once, then again, a little stronger. I forced myself to look, just enough to peek out. The shape was closer, maybe 15 yards away now, still drifting, still blurry around the edges. I stepped back from the window, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The room was filled with that light. If the shape looked directly at the window, it would see me easily. I closed the blinds slowly, trying not to make a sound. The little plastic slats touched each other louder than I wanted, like every click was amplified. When the blinds were down, the glow still filled the room, even brighter now that it had nowhere to escape. I stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do. I felt weirdly exposed, even though I was inside my own house. The walls felt thinner than they should have. After maybe a minute, or maybe 10, I honestly don't know, the warmth in the air intensified. Not painfully hot, but noticeably hotter. I touched my arm and my skin felt flushed, like I'd stood under a heat lamp too long. Then, underneath everything else, I felt vibration. Not in the floor, not the walls, in the air itself. A low, constant tremor that didn't make noise, just pressure, like standing next to massive speakers with no music playing. My teeth almost hurt from it. Something tapped the outside wall. Light. Deliberate. 2 taps, then silence. I held my breath. Another tap. Exactly the same spot. I walked toward the wall and pressed my ear against it, even though I was terrified of hearing something. I didn't hear anything, but the vibrations felt strongest there, like they centered on that exact point. The tapping came again, softer this time. I backed away fast. I don't know how long I stayed curled on the far side of the room, but eventually the brightness started to fade. Not suddenly, little by little, like fog thinning out. The warmth faded with it. The vibration weakened until it felt like barely anything. Then it stopped completely. After maybe a minute of total stillness, the usual night sounds returned all at once. A distant dog barking, wind rattling the leaves, a car rolling through the next street over, like someone had unmuted the world. I waited another minute before lifting the blinds. The street was completely normal. Dark, empty, quiet. Just the faint glow from a house a few blocks away. The sky was black and clear, stars visible again. Everything looked exactly the way it should. I checked the sidewalk, the road, the yards. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no burned patches, no equipment, no lingering fog. I finally worked up the nerve to go outside. The air was cold again, really cold. My breath fogged as soon as I stepped onto the porch. I walked out to the spot where I thought the shape had been, right near the mailbox across the street. The ground was damp from dew, completely undisturbed. I put my hand out, palm open, just to feel the air. Nothing. No warmth. No vibration. But while I stood there listening, I realized something strange. The smell of the air was different. Clean. Too clean. Like the air after a thunderstorm, but without the wind or the rain or the metallic tang. Just a faint, sterile freshness that didn't belong in the middle of a residential street at 3 a.m. It faded within seconds. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I usually don't bother in this neighborhood. When I looked around the room again, everything looked normal, but there was this odd heaviness in the air, like something had just moved through it and hadn't fully settled. I lay awake until sunrise. The next morning, nothing in the house seemed out of place. But when I opened the blinds again, one thing caught my eye. The paint on the outside wall, right where I'd heard the tapping, had a faint circular discoloration. A perfect circle, about the size of a quarter, not burnt, not scraped, just lighter, like the color had been gently pulled out of it. I touched it and it felt completely normal. I've checked it a dozen times since. It hasn't faded or changed. The circle is still there, perfectly even. No one else on the street mentioned anything the next day. Nobody complained about power outages or weird noises or strange lights. Everyone acted like it had been a regular night. I haven't seen the glow again. But sometimes, when the house is really quiet, I'll stop what I'm doing because I feel the faintest warmth in the air, just for a second, and I find myself looking out the window without really knowing why.